Hello everyone, Santer here, and welcome to part 2? I don't know. The warrior part of this skill review. So there's a couple of things I needed to cover before I begin going over the skills. I've got, all of the warrior skills on this character, so they're all listed over here. But we'll get to them in a moment. First, I need to go over a couple of specific things about how warrior works. So let's just start with some of the basics. First of all, warriors have relatively high armor. They have base 80 armor with 20 additional armor against physical, so they have more armor than most of the other professions at sort of a base level. They also have a couple of significant insignia. For example, there's a Stone Fist insignia here that I have on these gauntlets that increases knockdown duration by 1 second. It doesn't stack with other sources of that, but this allows you to increase the time somebody is knocked down up to 3 seconds. So there are some skills that can go kind of beyond that. Additionally, there are Knight insignias that warriors can use to reduce physical damage that they take if they're hit in that piece of armor. And there's also a general rune of Absorption. Superior Absorption here you can see reduces physical damage by 3. This applies wherever I'm hit. So warriors have a lot of stuff to make them very bulky, very tanky. So that's an important thing. They trade this off by having lower energy. This warrior actually has a bunch of Radiant insignia in his gear, which is giving him +7 energy. But normally they just have the default of 20 energy and 2 pips of energy regeneration. So while they are tankier in terms of base armor, they are less energy effective. Their cap is lower. Their profession relies more on adrenaline. You can see over here, just in these list of axe mastery skills, we'll go over that in a moment, but you can see how many of them just cost adrenaline. Energy costs are present, but they're rare. So warriors rely mostly on adrenaline rather than energy. So they tend to take a bit to get going in battle. They are primarily a physical attacking profession, in that they, have a really low energy pool, so they're terrible at spellcasting. Their energy throughput is just not good enough for that. And B, they have 3 different weapon attribute lines. So we'll go over those in just a moment. In fact, let's go ahead and talk about attributes now. Now, warrior's primary attribute is strength. And as you can see with this little display here, strength gives a special benefit, as all primary attributes do, and the strength benefit is 1% armor penetration when you use attack skills. This is any attack skill in the game. So if I were to, for whatever reason, go into marksmanship and use, say, not power shot, that one is a special skill, but like hunter shot, for example, I would get armor penetration based on my strength to that skill. So note that armor penetration affects the weapon damage portion, since any additional damage, so for example, Swift Chop, that +16 damage ignores armor, so it's just going to be on the weapons hit, but it does mean that they are going to hit a little bit harder than everyone else with attack skills. Note, specifically attack skills. Also, it doesn't affect, it's not additive. We'll talk about, I might as well bring this up now. Penetrating Chop right here has 20% armor penetration. It does not stack with strength, so it'll use this 20%. It does not get an additional benefit from strength. But that's what strength does. It gives you that little bit of armor penetration, means your attack skills hit a bit harder than anyone else's. So that's what their primary attribute does. Then and there's a bunch of utility skills in strength and tactics. And then axe mastery, hammer mastery, and swordsmanship are 3 different weapon skills. Warriors actually have 5 attribute lines. Most professions have 4. 5 is on the higher end. But you really, you pick one, right? You're not doing axe mastery and hammer mastery and swordsmanship. You could split across that, but you're really causing some... You're spreading yourself very thin for very little benefit, so there's not a good reason to do that. As for each weapon itself, so first of all, axes and swords are one-handed, so they can be used with a shield. Warriors can get tactics and strength shields. And hammers are two-handed, as you can see. This warrior was kitted out with a hammer. I do have a ton of different weapons on him, but swords are one-handed, and axes are one-handed, and then hammers are two-handed. So Hammer is also a bit slower. It has a higher amount of damage that it hits for. That's 19 to 35, but is a bit slower attack rate. Axes and swords have the same attack rate. Axes have a much broader range, 6 to 28 damage, versus swords, 15 to 22. Swords can't hit quite as hard as axes can, but they also can't hit as low either, so they're more consistent. In general, each one of these has sort of a thing or a theme going with it. So axes have kind of a specialty in deep wound and look for deep wound. Hammers have knockdown and weakness. Swords have bleed with a little bit of crippled as well. Axes also, like, they don't really have a secondary thing, maybe AoE, but all of them kind of have that. Back in the day, I'd say it was AoE, predominantly off of Cyclone Axe. We'll talk about that later. And then Triple Chop, which is kind of an elite version of that. But axes traditionally been the best because Deep Wound is a very strong condition, and axes have a lot of damage that they could pump out. Especially, one of the things I didn't talk about that's especially relevant to warriors is if an enemy is running away from you and you hit them with a melee attack, then you automatically critical hit, which is very strong for axes because they hit harder. And then Eviscerate here, again, we'll talk about it in a bit, has just been a staple. So axe has traditionally been one of the strongest ones. Hammer is actually much more controlling. It can hit very hard, but the fact that it knocks down is really good for stopping people from doing things, because getting knocked down, I failed to talk about it in the intro thing, but getting knocked down interrupts whatever you're doing, and you cannot perform most actions. You can use stances, however, and shouts, so that's relevant while you're knocked down, but otherwise most things you can't do while you're knocked down, so it's very good for disabling people. And weakness is also good for decreasing damage. So hammer has a lot of utility. Sword is a little bit weaker, actually. I would consider sword to be kind of the weakest of the warrior weapons, despite how popular it generally is. Its elites tend to be a little bit, I mean, we'll see as we go through, but they tend to be less exciting, and it's just less versatile. One of the problems that sword has is, as I mentioned, it has a favorite, it kind of favors bleed, which is a very weak condition, and a lot of enemies are non-fleshy and therefore immune to bleed, which kind of takes some of the teeth out of swordsmanship. So that's kind of a little bit of an overview of those, the attributes. I guess I might as well get into, I feel like there's something else that I needed to mention, but whatever, it can come to me later. I am going to be reviewing all of these with 12 attribute points, so there's going to be a little bit of time where I'm swapping my attribute points. So let's go ahead and just begin talking about these. I will cover the PvE only warrior skills towards the end. Spoilers, they're real strong. I might take a little bit of, because I'm going to be recording these on paper. Okay, so Agonizing Chop. So this is an interesting one. What's notable about this one is it has an activation time. Most attacks actually take longer than 1 second, and the 1 second, I believe attacks actually are unleashed partway through that activation time, if I'm not mistaken, so it comes out quite quickly. So let me go ahead and just read this. It's 6 adrenaline, 1 second activation time, axe attack. When this attack hits, you deal plus 17 damage. If the target is suffering from a deep wound, you interrupt that foe's action. Generally, this skill's strength is entirely on that 1 second activation time. This makes it very effective as a follow-up to a spike chain. This is stronger in PvP. Usually, Deep Wound is going to be the sort of thing that you use to take down an enemy. And so interrupting that foe is a little bit redundant. So this is a skill that I just don't use. 6 adrenaline is quite a bit. I guess I'd give this around a 2. My reasoning for this is I can see using this skill if you're trying to make a build that's utilizing that 1 second activation time, but this is not something I would just normally slot onto a bar, if that makes any sense. Okay, Axe Rake. 5 adrenaline, axe attack. if this attack hits a foe suffering from a deep wound, you strike for +8 damage, and that foe becomes crippled for 15 seconds. Okay, so a notable thing here, Agonizing Chop actually deals a bunch of additional plus damage. Axe Rake only deals that plus damage in a much meager amount if it hits a foe suffering from a deep wound. Because this attack only affects a foe suffering from a deep wound, it's extremely hard to actually use it to great effect. Now, you can apply deep wound, but again, that's kind of a finishing thing. I would give Axe Rake a 1. The reason is so crippled is a useful debilitating condition, but you need it to actually hit a foe. This thing is really unwieldy to use. Getting a deep wound off is usually a prelude to actually felling your foe. Crippling them becomes redundant at that point. Crippled is useful for snaring enemies, but you kind of want to do it in reverse. You're probably going to want to cripple them before applying deep wounds. So this skill's kind of backwards and super awkward from that standpoint. Axe Twist. 5 Adrenaline. Axe Attack. If this attack hits a foe suffering from a deep wound, you strike for +16 damage, and that foe suffers from weakness for 20 seconds. This is another one. It's the same sort of deal as Axe Rake. Again, they have to have a deep wound to strike for the additional damage. 5 Adrenaline is kind of medium. I think of low Adrenaline as being 2 to 3, medium being about 4 to 5, and then 6 is high, and 9 plus is very high, sort of, if that gives a general sense of the ranges. There's no reason to be inflicting weakness on a foe with deep wounds. +16 damage is certainly better than what Axe Rake is doing, but Axe Twist is super underwhelming to me. I cannot imagine a time when I'd want to use this. Again, the prerequisite of deep wound is just very, very strange, but you can see where this theme of we like enemies with deep wound kind of comes from. But to make something like Axe Rake or Axe Twist usable, I would maybe have the plus damage on if they have a deep wound, but always inflict the condition, but that would be a little contrary. I don't know. I don't know how to make these specifically useful because the thing that they're trying to do is not that great. Cleave, our first elite skill. I don't know how it decides where to display this display box, but so Cleave is 4 Adrenaline, elite axe attack. If this attack hits, you strike for +26 damage. This is a solid 3 to me. It's very low Adrenaline cost, relatively speaking, being at 4, which is generally on the lower end. +26 damage is really solid. It's reliable. The problem is it's in the elite slot. So I'm okay with running this skill, but as we'll see later, the sort of axe elite du jour is Eviscerate. And so Cleave is going to have a really hard time displacing that. This is useful if you are trying to get more damage in, but it's just fine, right? Critical Chop. This one's the first energy using one. It's 5 energy, 1 second activation time, 15 second recharge. It's an axe attack, and if it hits, you inflict +17 damage. If this attack results in a critical hit, the foe is interrupted. So I guess there's a little bit of a critical sub-theme going on in Axe all of a sudden here, or at least they're trying to figure out ways of doing things. This is very strange. This is this feels like an assassin skill to me. So the assassin profession has a primary attribute that increases critical hit chance, and they have some other skills that increase critical hit chance. So I would not tend to run Critical Chop on a warrior. I would tend to run it on an assassin warrior, because that would be most able to get the reliable interrupt in. However, this skill still has utility similar to Agonizing Chop in the sort of spike follow-up. Again, so spike is a term, I should define that, for dealing a lot of damage all at once. Usually you need multiple people to come together to do it, but something like the Warriors package being Eviscerate into Critical Chop or Agonizing Chop would be fairly common. That's more of a PvP tactic. It matters a little bit in PvE, but it's much more important in PvP, where you need to try to take somebody down quickly before healers can get their HP back up. Like I said, in PvE, that doesn't matter as much. You're typically not looking for having spike follow-ups in PvE. So this skill is kind of a weird spot to me. I think I'd probably give this one a 2. The reason why I'd give this a 2 is because I do think it has some use in specific builds that are ramping up the critical hits. I feel like it could work well on an assassin. It does have that spike follow-up property, but in general case, I'm just not bringing this. It's not reliable as an interrupt. There are other options if I want to interrupt things as a warrior under no attribute that we'll see later. And that conditionality makes it a bit awkward. 15-second recharge is a little bit on the lengthier side for an attack skill. You can see there's a 4 and a 6 on the screen right now. So, yeah, it's not a favorite. Cyclone Axe is a solid 5. If I'm running Axe, I'm probably running Cyclone Axe. It's 5 energy, 4-second recharge, Axe attack, performing a spinning Axe attack, striking for +10 damage to all adjacent opponents. This is an area of effect attack. It's kind of a staple of Axe in PvE, in my opinion. You want the ability to hit multiple enemies. Area of effect is just very, very strong. To be able to go into a group of enemies and hit all of them is what you want to be doing as much of the time as possible. And that makes this a staple for a PvP Axe build. There's not a whole lot more to say. It's just really, really, really good because of the effect that it has. Its effect is highly desirable. Hello, Decapitate. Decapitate is 8 adrenaline. It is an elite Axe attack. You lose all adrenaline and all energy. When it says that, it means all adrenaline from all of your skills goes down to 0, and all of your energy goes away. If this attack hits, you deal plus 41 damage and cause a deep wound for 17 seconds. This attack always results in a critical hit. It is also a solid 1. I am never bringing this. Losing all adrenaline and all energy is awful. This skill is outclassed by Eviscerate, also at 8 adrenaline. Now, this does hit harder than Eviscerate, but Eviscerate doesn't drain you of everything, so you can actually reliably follow up with another attack skill, potentially even the previously mentioned Agonizing Chop or Critical Chop. So, yeah, I'm never bringing Decapitate unless, I want to use Axe and I don't have any other elites and it's the best choice. That's going to be a hard case. The downside that this has is just way too high, and the amount of damage you're getting from it is just not good enough. Something that's really important to recognize, and I think I mentioned it during the overview video, is that the deep wound doesn't really quite proc, per se, unless they take a hit of damage, so you really want some sort of follow-up. And Decapitate prevents you from being able to do that yourself very effectively. You have to wait for the normal attacks. So, Dismember. So Dismember is kind of, I would put it in the same class of skills as Hammer Bash and Sever Artery that we'll be talking about later, or potentially Staggering Blow, in that all it does is it inflicts the condition du jour. It does the thing that the weapon is kind of built around condition-wise. So what this does is 5 adrenaline, Axe attack. If it hits, it inflicts a deep wound. That's it. It has some description about what Deep Wound does. It's for 17 seconds, which is pretty lengthy. I'm rarely going to ever bring this, though. This is... it feels better than a 1 to me, just because Deep Wound is good. But it doesn't feel like it belongs at 2 either. It feels a little... This is kind of weird. It feels a little too bad for 2. I think I'd probably actually give this a 3. Not because it's good, but because it's fine. Inflicting Deep Wound is strong, right? That's approximately 100 damage. 100 damage or 20% of max HP, which is ever is less, which is good. It's absolutely good. The 100 HP cap was added later to Deep Wound, by the way. I don't think it was an initial part of the design. But, I don't know. There's not a whole lot to say about this guy. It's fine. But I'm going to probably want Eviscerate over it. So, Disrupting Chop. So Disrupting Chop is 6 adrenaline, axe attack. If it hits, this attack interrupts the target's current action. If that action was a skill, that skill is disabled for an additional 20 seconds. So Disrupting Chop is actually pretty solid, but I'm only going to give it a 3. The reason for that is because it's usually not... So this attack has a couple of downsides. So it does always interrupt their action. That action can just be auto-attacking, by the way. So if they are performing a skill, it will interrupt that skill and disable it for an additional 20 seconds. That can be very strong. Disabling a skill for an additional period of time can really put pressure on. That's a stronger effect in PvP than it is in PvE, it should be noted. So that kind of is a little bit lackluster. It does not, however, activate quickly, and it costs 6 adrenaline. This means that it takes a while to build up to being able to use it. Okay? And when you do, it's not super reliable because you still have to wait for a normal attack speed hit. Something like Agonizing Chop has a quicker activation, or we'll see some other interrupts that are a bit stronger later on that have quicker activations. That disable is noteworthy of being good. And the fact that this is a reliable interrupt when you use it, it will interrupt, not like Agonizing Chop that has a prerequisite. Makes it a little bit easier to use in that regard, but a little bit hard to use in others. So I don't think it's quite one territory. Like, I'm not upset to run this. I'm just always going to find something better. So, yeah, that feels like a solid 3 to me. Okay, this brings us to Eviscerate. Now, Eviscerate's kind of a combination of Executioner's Strike, which we'll see in a moment because it's the next skill, and Dismember. It's 8 adrenaline, elite axe attack. If it hits, it strikes for plus 25 damage and inflicts a deep wound for 17 seconds. So plus 25 damage, that's pretty similar to Cleave. It is 8 adrenaline, which is a lot. However, the fact that this is a pretty big chunk of damage with the plus 25 and deep wound is very, very strong. And having those in combination is very strong. This has just generally been an axe staple. I think personally, I would probably be inclined to put it at about a 4, though. It might be worthy of a 5, but the single targetedness of it, I don't know. It's definitely really up there. But the thing is, I think that there is some competition that it has. It's what I'm automatically bringing, but I can see situations where I'm not always bringing it, if that makes sense. There are other times where I want to bring stuff, versus Cyclone Axe, which is basically stapled to my bar. Executioner's Strike, 8 adrenaline, axe attack that hits for plus 34 damage. This is a 3 for me. The reason is, like, yes, it does a lot of additional damage, but 8 adrenaline's an awful lot. If this was 7, it might be able to bump up to a 4, but 8 adrenaline is a pretty hefty investment. And again, there's other things that I'm generally going to be bringing over it. Cyclone Axe, Whirlwind Attack, which we'll see later. Again, we're in PvE. Are some examples of skills that I would tend to bring ahead of it. Also note that I usually run about 3 to 4 attack skills on a bar, and the rest is going to usually be utility. So this is kind of trying to compete for one of those narrow spots. It often won't quite get in. It's a fine skill, and it's fine to bring, but it's very... Like, this icon for me is super nostalgic, because, like, this is one of the early attack skills you get in Prophecies. So this guy's had this skill for a very long time, since his very early days. So that icon is super iconic to me, but the skill itself is just kind of... It's okay. Furious Axe. 5 energy, 6 recharge. Axe attack. If it hits, you strike for plus 29 damage, which is quite solid. If it is blocked, you gain 3 strikes worth of adrenaline. I think that I'm mostly going to give this one a 4, which might seem a little high, but plus 29 damage is pretty strong. Warriors are usually emphasizing adrenaline over energy, so you can probably fit it in. And further, being able to gain adrenaline on foes that are blocking is really useful. So I think this is a little bit better than it might look. The fact that you can use it at the start of a fight also, before you're built up adrenaline, is really useful, and that's something to keep in mind. It's usually beneficial to have an energy skill or two. Now, On counter side, it is competing for energy with Cyclone Axe, so that might ding it a little bit. But I feel like 4 is actually where I'd want to put this. It's one of the skills that I'm likely to run on my bar. That brings us to Keen Chop. Keen Chop is 3 adrenaline. It's an axe attack that always crits. That's its property. It does have a hidden property, of course. Strength gives it some armor penetration. So there's that. It's not good. I'm going to give this a 2. And the only reason why I'm giving this a 2 is because I could see arguments for running it on Assassin, because the automatic crit on Assassin has some benefit. But I'm not going to run this on a Warrior. It's very close to a 1 for me, and it's just the possibility of it kind of slotting into an Assassin bar that kind of bumps it up. Assassins have a number of skills that trigger on critical hits, so this is a way of being able to use those reliably if you're deciding to run an Axe Assassin for some reason, which you might. It's maybe a little redundant, I don't know, but Keen Chop's not a great skill, so hardly ever going to run it. Next we have Lacerating Chop. This is not a skill I think about very often, which should tell you, oh yeah, this is super weird. So Lacerating Chop is 5 adrenaline. If Lacerating Chop hits, you deal plus 17 damage. If it strikes a knocked down foe, then it inflicts bleeding. This is all over the place. I don't know how you're supposed to use this. Like, it does reliably deal plus 17 damage, 5 adrenaline, which is okay, but let's be honest here. I'm going to be picking one of these 2 identical skills, Penetrating Blow, Penetrating Chop, before I pick Lacerating Chop for that. Striking a knocked down foe is narrow on Axe. You do have ways that you could do that. You could be running Shock, which is an elementalist spell that inflicts knockdown, that warriors will sometimes use. You could be running Shove, maybe. There's a couple of warrior skills that you could be running also. You could be trying to do a team build with it, but you're going through a lot of rigmarole to inflict bleeding, which is really kind of bad, and Axe doesn't care about bleeding, so it feels like it's setting you up. Like, it feels like you are using this off of a hammer attack, weapon swapping to Axe to try to get the Lacerating Chop in before your opponent gets up, which is questionable, and then switching to a sword to take advantage of the bleed. This is all kinds of all over the place. This is a 1 for me. It does not fit into the Axe themes. The reward, so it would be fine to have some sort of interesting reward for striking a knocked down foe in Axe, right? It's not what Axe does, but you can bleed themes a little bit. That's fine. It feels weird because it feels like it's trying to blend all of the themes, and striking a knockdown foe is a higher classification of thing you're accomplishing, and the reward of bleeding is just really bad. If that inflicted an additional damage and deep wound or something, which would be more in line with Axe, then this would be fine. Or if it had a different requirement for inflicting bleeding, if it just straight up inflicted bleeding or something, then I could see it. But this requirement of knockdown is way too high. The plus 17 damage is not worth it when you have Penetrating Blow and Penetrating Chop doing the same thing with better, at the same adrenaline cost, with a benefit that's better and automatic. So Lacerating Chop is just no. That's just a solid no. Penetrating Blow and Penetrating Chop are the exact same skill. They both cost 5 adrenaline and strike for plus 17 damage and have a built-in 20% armor penetration. The reason why they're the same skill is when ArenaNet was designing factions, they thought they'd get a little cute and include duplicate skills. It's kind of like in Magic the Gathering where you have, say, Grizzly Bears and Runeclaw Bears, where it's the exact same card with a different name, so you can have additional copies in your deck. It's the same skill, but you can have additional copies on your bar. It's an okay skill. Both of these are a 3 to me. It's a filler. I'm okay with running it. It's probably a high 3. It's not quite a 4, because I'm not looking to run them, but if I want to slot in a skill, these are probably what I would pick. I don't know. Maybe they deserve to be Force. You know what? I'm going to revise them to Force. Just because, yeah, I'm probably going to run these over a lot of the other Axe skills. 5 adrenaline is low enough to be reliable to use, and it's just reliable damage. So I'm probably going to pick him over a lot of things. So yeah, there's not a whole lot to say about them. They're just like raw damage. That whole thing of like duplicating the skill in factions was an interesting idea. They did it for the 6 professions from prophecies. Elementalist ones got changed, so but not the other professions because they were. It's a whole history of the game I don't need to get into here because it's a skill review, not a recollections. I do want to do a recollections of the game, but so penetrating chop, penetrating blow, they're fine, solid skills. Not a whole lot to say about them though. Swift chop, 5 energy for recharge, axe attack. If it hits, you strike for plus 16 damage. If it is blocked, then the foe takes 16 damage and suffers a deep wound for 20 seconds. So blocking, by the way, is just like a thing that means the attack effectively doesn't hit. It's kind of like the other side of miss. There used to be block and evade, and they made those just one. They merged them into just block. Probably because there's more things where that made sense. Whatever. It's fine. So if Swift Chop is blocked, it has an additional effect, just like Furious Axe has an additional effect. Gaining 3 adrenaline is, in my opinion, more useful than inflicting a little bit of damage in a deep wound, just because that fuels all of your other skills. Furious Axe also hits for plus 29 damage as opposed to plus 16, and honestly, the 2 seconds quicker recharge is just not worth it. It's okay. So this is a 3 to me. I'm not looking to run it. I don't hate it if I'm running it, but I don't want to run it. I'd pick Furious Axe over this every single time, which is why Furious Axe is a 4. It's okay. That's really all I have to say about it. It's nice to have things that benefit when your opponent's blocking, but I'd rather bring skills that get rid of the block, because blocking is being caused by some effect, so I'd rather do something about that. Triple Chop. 5 energy, 10-second recharge, elite axe attack. Attack target foe and adjacent foes. Each attack that hits deals plus 34 damage. So this is basically an elite version of Cyclone Axe, but it is actually worse. Yes, it hits for more damage. Plus 34 is substantial damage. But it also has like 2.5 times the recharge. 10 seconds as opposed to 4. Just to scroll up here, just to remind you. Cyclone Axe is 4-second recharge. Triple Chop is 10. So while it does deal substantially more damage, it is an elite, so it takes up the elite slot. That is a strong consideration. And Cyclone Axe has a much faster recharge, which is preferable over Triple Chop, just because you can use it more often. If I'm only going to bring one of these, I'm going to bring Cyclone Axe every time. I am happy to run both, however, and Triple Chop is totally worthy of a 4. It's not, like, a skill that I'm often wanting to bring with me, but it is one that I'm happy to run. Because, again, hitting an AoE is very good, and having large additional damage from the AoE is also very good, so useful skill. Okay, final axe mastery skill is Whirling Axe. It's 4 adrenaline, it's an elite axe attack, and if it hits, you strike for plus 17 damage, and any stance being used by your target ends. This attack cannot be blocked. So this one's a little bit of a mixed bag. It's 4 adrenaline, which is very low, but it is weaker than Cleave. Cleave, for reference, was 26 damage, if we scroll all the way back up here. Whirling Axe deals only 17, which is a substantial decrease. However, it is unblockable and end stances. This is useful because often it is a blocking stance that you're looking to end, and therefore being unblockable is important for that. On the other hand, usually you want something that does not require adrenaline in order to end those stances, because building up adrenaline against an opponent who is blocking you with a blocking stance, Whirling Defense being a very good example of that, we'll talk about that with Rangers, it's a pretty long-lasting Ranger blocking stance, though. Whirling Axe and Whirling Defense, nice match there. It's really, really hard to build up adrenaline against a blocking foe, because when they block your attack, you don't gain any adrenaline. You can bring Furious Axe, of course, to build up adrenaline if they block that, and other skills to build it up. So there are ways that you can kind of build to try to get around that a little bit. But frankly, between the low damage and the awkwardness of an adrenaline-based stance ender, this is a 3 to me. Like, it sounds nice, but really requiring adrenaline is kind of what kills it. Most other stances I don't care about ending as much. It's almost always blocking stances. Now, keep in mind that this is specifically referring to PvE. There are times in PvP where being able to end a stance that somebody's using that's not a blocking stance is beneficial. But most of the time you're going to run Eviscerate, and this is an elite. That's part of what damages this. If this was not an elite skill, it would probably be a 4. But because it's an elite skill and is therefore competing for the elite slot, it goes way down. Because it's going to be so hard to make use of. You're going to just... Trust me, trying to use this is going to be a struggle and a half, because it's just going to be so hard to like, you're giving up your elite slot, and its effect is mediocre. Like, useful, but mediocre enough compared to that. So, yeah. Anyway, that's enough about that skill. Let's go ahead and move on to Hammer Mastery. Again, I'm going to get this up to 12. Okay. So, Hammer Mastery. We're going to start off with Auspicious Blow, which is 5 adrenaline. As a reminder, weakness and knockdown are kind of the themes in Hammer Mastery. Need a drink of water there. So Auspicious Blow is 5 adrenaline. It's a hammer attack. If it hits, you strike for plus 17 damage and gain 7 energy. And if your foe is suffering from weakness, this attack is unblockable. The unblockable clause is nice. It's a nice little add-on. It is not the strength of the skill. The strength of this skill is the fact that it gains you 7 energy. Plus 17 damage is nice as well, but again, gains you 7 energy. This is a solid 4 for me. I'm not going to bring it every time, but it's going to beat out most other normal hammer skills, just because this effect, again, of some additional damage, yes, but gaining 7 energy, unconditionally gaining 7 energy, is very good. So, yeah. That's a pretty strong skill. Anytime you have energy management like this, it can slot into a lot of builds, because being able to manage your energy like that is always going to be useful. Backbreaker. So Backbreaker is awkward. It's 9 adrenaline. It is an elite hammer attack. If it hits, you strike for plus 16 damage, and your target is knocked down. If you have 8 strength or higher, this knockdown lasts 4 seconds. That clause of 8 strength or higher was added to prevent abuse by assassins, apparently. 4-second knockdown is very long. Now, keep in mind, there are large enemies that cannot be knocked down, so knockdown is not always going to work. You're going to want to be aware of an area before you bring a skill. Honestly, this skill is like a 3 for me. It's not awful, but 9 is an awful lot of adrenaline. And I'd rather bring a skill that has less adrenaline and just knocks down for a normal length of time. A little bit of plus damage is fine, but it's hardly what I'd call an exciting skill. 4-second knockdown is a very long time of debilitation, though, so it makes it very strong in PvP, but in PvE, that just doesn't matter as much. Belly Smash, 5 energy, 1-second activation time, 10-second recharge, hammer attack. If this attack strikes a foe who is knocked down, the resulting dust cloud will blind adjacent foes for 6 seconds, which is going to hit your target as well. This is a weird one. It's a 2 to me. It's a very specific, rather conditional effect of blind. If I'm going to be trying to blind multiple enemies, this is not the profession I'm going to do it with. I'm not going to do it with a warrior. I'm going to do it with elementalist. Possibly like mesmer. I'd even run throw dirt on a ranger over belly smash. First of all, the opponent has to be knocked down. The 1-second activation time is nice. There's no plus damage on this, however. Blind is strong, but this is just not who you're trying to do blinding with. So it's narrow. I could maybe see running to run it on something, but it's super, super narrow. So I'm probably not going to want to ever run this just because it's very narrow, very awkward. It's probably close to a 1, honestly. The 1 second activation time maybe redeems it a little bit. Counter Blow. 4 adrenaline. Hammer attack. If this attack hits an attacking foe, that foe is knocked down. I think this is a 4, actually. That's maybe a little high. Actually, I'm going to give it a 4. It's probably about a 3.5. So I'm going to round up to a 4. It's very low adrenaline for this skill. Knocking down for 4 adrenaline is super cheap. The requirement of the foe being attacking isn't too tough, but note that this cannot stop you or allow you to stop somebody from casting spells. It doesn't work as an interrupt that way. It only works as an interrupt for attacking. But that adrenaline cost is super aggressive, so that really bumps this up quite a bit in my estimation. It makes it significantly stronger. Probably combos okay with Belly Smash, but again, Belly Smash, pretty narrow. I'm not always going to bring Counter Blow, but it's one of those skills that's going to be in contention for a bar. So it definitely deserves to be up there. Crude Swing. 5 energy, 5 second recharge. Hammer attack. Attack all adjacent foes. Each foe you hit is struck for plus 16 damage. This is a 5. What a surprise. It's an AoE attack. That's all you really need to know. That's why it's a 5. It's not Cyclone Axe. It hits a little bit harder than Cyclone Axe, recharges a little bit more slowly, but it's pretty close to Cyclone Axe. Funnily enough, this skill has undergone some serious change over the years. It used to have like massive armor decreases and all sorts of stuff, but it's fine. I will bring... It's actually a great skill now. I will bring Crude Swing almost automatically on a hammer bar because, again, area of effect is just that strong. Crushing Blow. So Crushing Blow is 5 energy, 10 second recharge. Hammer attack. If it hits, you strike for plus 16 damage, and if your foe is knocked down, you also inflict a deep wound for 17 seconds. So, this skill is really good. I'm giving it a 4, however. Simply because I tend to bring Fierce Blow, which you can see down below, more often. There's a couple reasons for that. First of all, this does have a 10-second recharge. The other issue with Crushing Blow... so you obviously use a knockdown attack, then you follow up with this. The problem with Crushing Blow is not all foes can be knocked down, so all foes can be weakened, which is what Fierce Blow triggers off of. We'll see it in a few. But if I am bringing a knockdown, I'm probably bringing Crushing Blow. It notably works with skills like Hammer Bash, which cause you to lose all adrenaline, and Heavy Blow, which also causes you to lose all adrenaline. Because it does not require adrenaline. So note that it works with a couple of other powerful skills automatically because of that. So it is very good. It's very strong. Your sources of deep wound are super important. This does play off of the whole knockdown theme. It's a really good skill. But I do tend to bring Fierce Blow over it because Fierce Blow is a touch bit more reliable. Devastating Hammer. 7 adrenaline, elite hammer attack. If Devastating Hammer hits, your target is knocked down and suffers from weakness for 17 seconds. So this is a really, really good skill. I'm probably not, I'm probably giving this a 4. In terms of elite knockdown skills, this is very high up there. It does also weakness as well, so it does both themes. It inflicts both themes of hammer, knockdown and weakness. It's very solid. The thing that keeps it from being like a 5 or something is Forceful Blow exists, and it's competing for an elite slot with it. Forceful Blow is probably going to be very highly rated. It's probably going to be a 5 because I bring it all the time. We'll talk about why when we get down to it. But 7 adrenaline is, a higher end, but this does not cause you to lose all of your adrenaline, which many of the non-elite options do. We'll talk about those with Hammer Bash and Heavy Blow in particular. Devastating Hammer can also be really good for setting up certain chains of skills. So this is just a really good, really versatile knockdown. And I'm going to bring it some of the time that I'm running hammer. So I'm happy to run it. Earthshaker. 8 adrenaline. It is an elite hammer attack. Target foe and all adjacent foes are knocked down. It has a 50% failure chance with hammer mastery 4 or less. The failure there is so that way you have to spec into hammer at least some to be able to make use of it. Otherwise, you'd be able to... This skill has no specific link to hammer mastery other than it's a hammer attack, so like hammers need to use it, or you need to wield a hammer to use it. And if you want any damage from it, obviously you're going to need to spec and hammer. But the only link there is that failure chance to keep you from being able to use it as 0 spec. So you have to have at least 5 in hammer mastery to be able to use Earthshaker reliably. This is a strong skill. If I want to knock down, there's a decent chance I'll bring this. I wouldn't rate this personally as highly as Devastating Hammer, but some of that's probably past experience bias. 8 adrenaline is a good bit. I'm going to give this one a 4 as well, however. And the reason for that is, again, it's area of effect, and area of effect knockdown is strong. And I am happy to use this from that standpoint. But I'm tending to pick... So when I use hammer, I tend to lean more on the weakness angle than the knockdown angle. So that's what pushes Devastating Hammer up a bit in my evaluation. But Earthshaker is still very solid, so happy to run it. Enraged Smash. 5 energy, 5-second recharge, elite hammer attack. If it hits, you gain 3 strikes of adrenaline. If you hit a moving foe, you strike for plus 34 damage, and your target is knocked down. So the primary effect of this skill is gaining 3 strikes of adrenaline, which is strong for hammer. It helps power it up a lot. It is kind of like an elite version of a strength skill called Bull's Strike, I think it is. We'll talk about it later. You'll see it. Which also strikes for additional damage and knocks down moving foes. The effect is actually pretty strong, so I should probably run this more often than I do. I kind of want to give it a... I don't know. I'm going to give this a 3. Because, like, while it is effective and fairly strong, I just don't run this that often. Not dealing additional damage is a bit of a detriment. Gaining 3 strikes of adrenaline is pretty strong, though. So it's definitely something I should consider. I'm actually curious, if I bump this up to 15, does it go up to, 4 strikes of adrenaline and plus 40 damage. So that's definitely pretty strong if you're really speccing in hammer, which you probably are. So I don't know. This definitely seems like a solid skill. It's around a 3 to a 4 for me. Because gaining 3 strikes of adrenaline is really nice for charging up hammer. It does not play into the weakness theme, and the knockdown and plus damage are unreliable. But this is definitely really solid if you are specifically trying to line back, which is something that you see with hammer. It's more of a PvP concept, but you can... It's totally valid to do in PvE as well. What it refers specifically to is chasing people who are chasing other melee attackers who are attacking your backline. So if you have somebody attacking like your healers and your other casters with a melee weapon, you go and chase them down. Your caster should be kiting, which is running around to try to avoid taking damage or to reduce damage. And then you should be chasing the people who are chasing them, and Enraged Smash is really good for that role. It is an elite, though, and giving up your elite slot for that is kind of painful. It is directly competing with, what's that strength skill? I'm going to just look it up. Bull's Strike. It's directly, like you can see right here, it's got a quicker recharge than Bull's Strike. Bull's Strike works with any melee weapon. And of course, I don't have any points, or I only have 1 point in strength, so this is not showing you as full plus damage right now. But it's basically an elite version of this for hammers only, which has some benefit if you're running hammer on something else. But this seems like a solid skill to me. Fierce Blow. 6 adrenaline, hammer attack. If Fierce Blow hits, you strike for plus 17 damage. And if your target was suffering from weakness, they also suffer from deep wound for 7 seconds. This is a 5 for me. I bring this all the time when I'm using hammer. This is my go-to source of deep wound on hammer. This is, of course, playing into the weakness theme. It's kind of a counterpart to Crushing Blow. Crushing Blow, of course, being the plus 16 damage if they're knocked down, inflicts deep wound. This is plus 17, so basically the same amount of plus damage, and inflicts deep wound if they have weakness. Like I said, I tend to play into that theme more often. It does work with Devastating Hammer and Forceful Blow. Forceful Blow, which we'll talk about next. So I feel like this is a very solid skill, and I tended to use it all the time, perhaps preferentially so. Again, these are kind of my subjective ratings for like how often I'm using these skills and things like that, what I think about them. And part of the idea is I want to make a program to randomly generate pools of skills. So something like Fierce Blow, I want to show up less often, so I'm kind of required to approach using hammer in a different way. I almost always bring Fierce Blow when I run hammer, so it is definitely a 5. As is Forceful Blow. 5 Adrenaline, Elite Hammer Attack. If Forceful Blow hits, you strike for plus 26 damage, and any stance being used by target foe ends. They also suffer from weakness for 17 seconds. This attack cannot be blocked. This is what Whirling Axe wants to be. It's 1 more Adrenaline for Forceful Blow, but huge plus damage at plus 26, which is the same as Cleave. It ends a stance, cannot be blocked, and inflicts weakness. Like, that's doing a lot. This is just a super, super strong skill. Like, this is good at plus 26 damage and inflict weakness for 5 Adrenaline. Adding on unblockable stance canceling is just icing on the cake. This skill is loaded. It does so much. It's super strong, and is part of why I always run Fierce Blow, because this is an incredibly powerful elite skill for a hammer. It's like 5 Adrenaline is super low. The plus damage is actually really high for hammer. Hammer tends to have low plus damage, relatively speaking. So 26 is very, very high for hammer. Axe tends to have some of the higher plus damages. It's part of why it's such a good weapon. Hammer tends to be on the lower end. Like, if you look at a lot of these hammer pluses, when they do get them, they tend to be around 15 to 18, kind of in that range. So getting, like, yeah, like, if you look at a lot of these, you're getting kind of these similar sort of ranges of, like, some of these are not quite that, but anyway, the point that I'm getting at is plus 26 damage is very strong, and inflicting weakness is good, and, like, the icing on the cake is the unblockable stance canceling. So this is like my go-to hammer elite. It's the one that I always use, so it's very, very good. Hammer Bash. 6 Adrenaline, lose all Adrenaline, and if it hits, your target is knocked down. This is like your bread and butter staple version. I mentioned this earlier. It's like Dismember and Sever Artery. Hammer Bash just does the thing that hammers do, knocks down the foe. It does cost all Adrenaline, however, because knockdown is strong. This skill is, like, I want to give this a 1. Because, like, I never use this, and I never want to use this. Knockdown is good, but it's not so good in PvE that it's worth all of your Adrenaline. I'd rather run Counter Blow over it every day. It's Devastating Hammer is kind of like an elite version of it. I'm going to want to pick Devastating Hammer if I want knockdown, if I'm specifically going for knockdown, or I'm going to want to try to work Yeti Smash, make that work. Yeah, like, basically, if I'm going to try to do knockdown on hammer, I'm not going for Heavy Bash to do it, or for Hammer Bash to do it. I'm going for something else, probably an elite, but the cost of all of your Adrenaline is just way too high to make this viable, in my opinion. Heavy Blow. 5 Adrenaline, Hammer Attack, lose all Adrenaline. If this attack hits a foe suffering from weakness, that foe is knocked down, and you strike for plus 24 damage. This one, for whatever reason, is a 2 for me. I think it's in part because 5 Adrenaline is lower. It does deal very high plus damage for hammer. The knockdown is conditioned on the opponent being weakened, which makes Hammer Bash more reliable in that regard. But Heavy Blow's plus damage is significant, and the lower adrenaline means that you're able to get to it just that extra hit quicker, which is very nice. So I'm generally going to bring this and combo it. Like, I could see comboing, doing a build that's like Forceful Blow, Heavy Blow, Crushing Blow, where you're chaining these together in order to get your, like, this hits the target for a bunch of damage, weakens them, you follow up with a Heavy Blow to knock them down and deal a bunch of plus damage, and then this to inflict your deep wound. Like, I could see something like that. So Heavy Blow, I feel like it says I combo with things more than other skills do. So Hammer Bash, it's more reliable, but I don't know. Something about the fact that this, like, explicitly says it combos with stuff makes it feel better to me. And the plus damage is definitely good. Irresistible Blow, 5 energy, 6 recharge, 6 I can't recharge, to be clear. Hammer Attack, if it hits, you strike for plus 17 damage. If Irresistible Blow is blocked, your target is knocked down and takes 17 damage. Fun fact, there are strength versions of this. Griffin's Sweep and Leviathan's Sweep are a strength version. Irresistible Blow has a lesser recharge at 6 seconds as opposed to 8. I'm not sure if its damage is better. Let's go ahead and bump my strength up to 12 so we can compare damage. So Leviathan Sweep plus 17 damage, and then that's 29 on Griffin Sweep / Leviathan Sweep. Griffin Sweep and Leviathan Sweep are just like Penetrating Blow, in that they're the same skill, just one. This is Prophecies and this is Factions. It's just the thing. So that's plus 17 damage, 29 additional. This does less damage on the knockdown. It recharges a little bit more quickly, but they both deal plus 17. Is that right? And Leviathan Sweep can be run with any weapon. Now, the advantage of Irresistible Blow, of course, over those is that it will be more effective in the hands of secondary because you can't put strength if you're not a warrior. This is still like just a 3 to me. It's a very meh effect. Like, it's not bad, but it's not good. So I'm never bringing it because other things outclass it. Sorry. Yeah, that's just kind of where it's at for me. It's just very, very middle of the road. Mage Hunter's Smash. 8 Adrenaline, Elite Hammer Attack. If this attack hits, target foe is knocked down. If your target is under the effects of an enchantment, this attack cannot be blocked. This is a 3 for me. Yeah, it's a knockdown, but, like, it's never getting on my bar ahead of Devastating Hammer. If this was not an elite skill, and it was just a Hammer Bash that costs 2 more adrenaline and doesn't drain all of your adrenaline and has this nice, like, can't be blocked if they're enchanted effect, cool. This feels particularly targeted for Guardian, which is a very common monk enchantment that causes... it lasts for a little bit, and they have the enchanted character has a 50% chance to block. Or Aegis, which also does a similar sort of effect for the whole party. It feels like it's specifically targeted at that, but it doesn't do anything about the blocking, so... this feels like it might have PvP applications if you want to specifically be, like, reliably knocking down somebody who's more likely to be blocking with enchantments than with stances. But, or just likely to be enchanted, and you want to be able to knock them down. But, like, 8 adrenaline is a lot, and Earthshaker gives me AoE knockdown. Forceful Blow is way cheaper. If I want a single target knockdown, Devastating Hammer is 1 adrenaline cheaper and inflicts weakness, which is nice. So, this is okay, but, like... No? Just not quite good enough for me. Mighty Blow. This is very interesting to compare to Executioner's Strike. Because Executioner's Strike... obviously, I don't have spec in Axe Mastery at this point because I took it all out. But Executioner's Strike hits for similar-ish levels, but Mighty Blow is an adrenaline cheaper. It's 7 adrenaline. If it hits, you strike for plus 34 damage. This is a solid 3 for me. It doesn't do anything special. It does inflict a lot of additional plus damage, but the thing is, I'm always going to bring something that does something special over it. So 7 is, again, a good bit of adrenaline as well. The damage is there for it, but, like, all it does is deal a nice chunk of damage, and that's going to have a hard time fitting on my bar when I want things that do stuff. This is your crawworm type creature, like your big green fatty. Yeah, it's nice filler, nice top end, but like it has no particular abilities, so it's just like, okay, this is fine, but those cards are never going to compete in like a competitive environment where you pick your cards, right? Because there's always something that is something better, and that's exactly where Mighty Blow's at. Mokele Smash, something like that. Mokele. It's 5 energy, 12-second recharge. Hammer attack. If this attack hits, you strike for plus 17 damage and gain 2 strikes of adrenaline. This is very similar to Enraged Smash, except the damage is reliable but less, and it has much longer recharge. And gets you less adrenaline, the 2 strikes being set. This is okay. It's a really nice opener. The damage is pretty standard, I feel, for Hammer. Gaining 2 strikes of adrenaline is really good for Hammer because a lot of the attacks are on the higher end, I feel. At least I think of them as that way. So it's nice for building up to stuff. I feel like I would tend to pick this over the mainline stuff, so this is a 4. But a very unexciting 4. So I guess I would... Yeah, that's kind of where it's at. Like, gaining 2 strikes of adrenaline, super strong. But the skill overall is fairly unexciting, but still kind of better than a bunch of them. So, Overbearing Smash. This is 5 energy, 20-second recharge. Hammer attack. If this attack hits, you deal plus 16 damage. If target foe is knocked down, that foe is dazed for 7 seconds. 7-second daze is good enough for inflicting stuff, but knockdown is something that's usually setting up a KO. You're usually, if you're knocking down a target, you're going to be trying to kill that target. So, or you're going to do something during that window of knockdown. And PvP, I don't see this succeeding in any particular format. The effect, like, Daze is really good. Don't get me wrong. In terms of the debilitating factor of Dazed, it's very high because it basically means that if you stay on that caster is not getting anything off, or it's going to be very hard for them to get anything off. But this is a 20-second recharge, which is pretty long, and the Dazed is contingent on the foe being knocked down. That's not how I'm going to be inflicting Dazed. It's knocked down is a pretty big hoop to jump through. You have a very short window to apply it, so you're not like running over to somebody or whatever. So this is actually probably a 1 for me. It feels like it maybe deserves a little bit more than that, but like, if I'm going to be blunt, I'm never going to bring this. 20-second recharge is long, plus 16 damage is fine for Hammer, but like 7 seconds of dazed for that, for like knocking down the target first, I'd rather just kill them. That's going to be more effective at stopping them from casting anything. And if they're getting healed by something else, dazed isn't going to help. So yeah, I'm not going to bring this because if I'm knocking something down, I want Crushing Blow because I want that deep wound to take them down, not dazed. So yeah. Pulverizing Smash. 4 adrenaline. Hammer attack. If you hit a knocked down foe, that foe suffers from weakness and a deep wound for 17 seconds. This is a weird one, and that's kind of combining stuff. I basically never bring this, not because it's bad per se, but because it's kind of like stapling 2 weird effects together. I would consider bringing this, I guess. But so, first of all, you're going to be wanting to use this off of probably an elite knockdown, in which case, like, Devastating Hammer already inflicts weakness, so something like Crushing Blow or Fierce Blow is better, because they do additional damage. You could potentially try to slot it in with Counter Blow, because they're both for adrenaline. That works out pretty well, but like that's kind of awkward. Basically, Pulverizing Smash is a solution looking for a problem, and like the things that do the stuff, like inflicting weakness is easier to do in Hammer with other skills, and inflicting Deep Wound is better to do with Hammer with other skills. So this is just it's another one. Like, I'm never gonna bring this. Not because it's like bad, but because it's like it doesn't solve any problem. Like other things do everything it does better, and it's like I don't need this package. So yeah, that's its problem. Renewing Smash, 5 energy, 1 second recharge, or 1 second cast time, 30-second recharge. Hammer attack, if Renewing Smash hits, it deals plus 34 damage. If you hit a knocked down foe, you gain 3 energy, and this attack recharges instantly. So for the most part, if you don't have Stone Fist, with Stone Fist, I think you might be able to get this off twice during a knockdown. Without it, you'll probably get it off once, but it is strong. Plus 34 damage is huge. And the fact that it has a quick activation means that you can quickly follow up a knockdown with it. And on top of that, it refunds part of the energy cost and recharges instantly if you hit a knockdown foe. Like, you can use this as a general spike follow-up in between stuff if you want to anyway, because the 1 second activation time and plus 34 damage is very strong. 30-second recharge is super long for that. But the knockdown effect is very, very good. This is a 4 for me. This is going to be a Hammer attack that I'm going to bring probably more often than a lot of them. Hammer is actually looking pretty good. There's a bunch of 4s here, but it definitely beats out a bunch of the skills. So this one's super good. Staggering Blow, 4 adrenaline, 1 second activation time, which I don't know when the heck they added that or if it's always been there. But Hammer attack, if it hits, your target will suffer from weakness for 17 seconds. This is the Sever Artery of Hammer. It reliably inflicts weakness. So this does a little bit better than something like Pulverizing Smash. 1, the weakness is unconditional. 2, it has a quick activation time. The quick activation time is very, very good. That's a very strong effect. That said, this skill is probably about a... it's probably a 3. Which might seem high, but like... it doesn't quite feel in 2 territory to me. It feels like just kind of a generic skill you might slot onto a bar, but everything's going to be better than it. It's not like awful. Like, it's not in the same sort of category as something like Pulverizing Smash is, right? But it's outclassed. So the quick activation time does do a lot for it. The unconditional weakness is fine, but it's just outclassed by basically most of the skills you have. So it's hard to conceive of a time when I'd actually bring it, and that's the main reason. Yeti Smash is kind of like an unelite version of Earthshaker. So it's 6 adrenaline, Hammer attack, lose all adrenaline, so that's a pretty big downside. It attacks all adjacent foes, so it does damage to all adjacent foes. And if it strikes a foe suffering from a condition, that foe is knocked down. 50% chance, failure chance if Hammer Mastery is 4 or less. Again, this has no scaling with Hammer Mastery. This is a fine skill. Losing all adrenaline is a big downside. Hitting all adjacent foes and potentially knocking them down is pretty good, but you do have to be in a team build that is spreading conditions around quite a lot, or it becomes very unreliable. It does not care what condition it is, so it's a bit more versatile than, say, Heavy Blow is. But, yeah, so it's a fine skill. I would probably give it... This is like a 3.5, so I'm going to round this up to a 4. I'm not generally bringing this, but, like, there will definitely be times when I am bringing this, and it's not hard to set up a team build to inflict conditions on everything, because you're generally going to want to do that anyway. So I feel like this is just a pretty solid skill. Yeah, it's either a 4 or a 2. And I decided to go with 4. So I'm overall, like, okay with running it. Okay, let's move on to strength. Now, reminder, strength is the primary attribute, so most of these are not usable outside of warrior primary because it's going to be functioning as 0, not as a 12. So keep in mind that there is that bit of influence, I guess, in the ratings. Whoops, I closed stuff, and now all my strength skills are... I will note if a skill is useful outside, basically. I meant to do that. This is a shout. It's 5 energy, 8-second recharge. If you are knocked down, you gain 4 strikes of adrenaline. This is a 2. It's a build around me that technically you can build around, but it's questionable. I can see building around it. Yeah. Like, so I'm probably never bringing this because what this is trying to do is not that great. The effect is just very narrow. However, gaining 4 strikes of adrenaline is pretty good. So, I don't know. It's just not versatile enough. I Will Avenge You. This skill has a history to it. It abbreviates to IWAY or IWAY, which was a serious build in PvP, in specifically the Hall of Heroes area. Heroes Ascent, as it later got renamed. Tomb of the Primeval Kings originally. A bunch of game history stuff. The effect of this skill, 5 energy, 45-second recharge. It's a shout. For each dead ally, which includes things like pets, you gain 10 seconds of +6 health regeneration, and your attack speed increases by 25%. So, the way that the build worked is it had a bunch of pets and stuff that would suicide, and then when they died, all of your warriors would use I Will Avenge You. +6 health regeneration is very strong. In terms of keeping you alive, that's gaining 12 HP per second. And increasing your attack speed by 25% is very good. So this makes you very durable and very deadly. But it's also extremely narrow. And in PvE, I will basically never run this, because setting up the effect to work properly is very difficult and tedious. It's probably usable in some circumstances if you have... missions where you're given allies, if it works off of them, and those allies can be dead. Some of the Eye of the North missions in particular. But again, this is a 2 because it is very narrow. If you build around it, it is very powerful. But building around it in PvE with heroes and stuff is going to be really hard to do and just not worth doing most of the time. So yeah, this is not what I would consider a good skill for the most part, despite its very potent history. A history so potent that way became kind of a suffix for specific types of builds that kind of came after it. Like Hexway is a really good example of that. So builds that came up after it had the way appendix added in a similar manner to the way that Scandals have gate added because of the Watergate Hotel. Yeah, just kind of an interesting historical note there. I Will Survive as a 1. I will explain why in just a moment. It's 5 energy, 30-second recharge, shout. You gain +3 health regeneration for each condition you are suffering. This regeneration expires after 10 seconds. Uptime is poor. It's 1/3 uptime, and that's at 12 spec of strength, the duration being the scalar. But it's for each condition you are suffering. If you are suffering from conditions, your healing staff is failing their job. You do not bring the skill because you are better off bringing Antidote Signet and going like part Ranger. Like my character right now is / Ranger for Antidote Signet, which removes conditions from you. In other words, instead of bringing something to regenerate your health while you're suffering from conditions, you're better off bringing something to remove the conditions from you so you're not suffering from them in the first place. There are many options. You can go with / Ranger, you can go / Monk. Even Paragon has some options. Necromancer has an option. You have choices of being able to be able to deal with conditions for yourself, and your party should have somebody to deal with conditions as well. So this skill is trying to slap a Band-Aid when cures exist and are readily accessible and easy to use. So it has absolutely no place. It doesn't do anything that you can't do a better effect for. So it's just never worth bringing. And that's that. That's that. You will die. 5 energy, 15-second recharge. Shout. If target foe is below 50% health, you gain 3 strikes of adrenaline. This to me is a solid 3. The effect is really good. Like, it helps you close out things. If your target foe is under 50% health, you can gain adrenaline. Like, that helps you finish them off, right? But 15 seconds is a little bit of a long recharge. I'm probably not going to be bringing this very often. If I want an effect to gain me adrenaline, I'm probably going to be using a Tactics Shout, whose name escapes me at the moment. To the Limit. We'll see that one later. That gains you adrenaline for each enemy nearby. The 50% condition is a little awkward to work with, but, you know, the effect is solid, so it might be worth bringing. Battle Rage. This is an elite. It is our first stance. I think, yeah, because Axe Mastery and Hammer Mastery don't have any stances. I should mention something really important about stances. You can only have one stance active at a time. Whenever you apply a stance, any stances you currently have end. That's called stance canceling. Intentionally doing that is like you might intentionally bring a skill to be a cancel stance. We will see why you might do that with specifically a couple of later skills. Flail is a really good example, and Frenzy are good examples of stances that you want to have cancel stances for. But we're here to talk about Battle Rage. So this is 4 adrenaline, elite stance. For 17 seconds, you move 33% faster and gain double adrenaline from attacks. Battle Rage ends if you use any non-adrenal skills. So this specifically ends if you use any skills that do not cost adrenaline. I haven't actually tested to see if it ends when you use a Signet. I imagine it does, because I imagine that's not an adrenal skill. The skill's okay. It's probably a 2, because you do really have to build around it. Now, while it's going, it's kind of like an elite version of Rush, which we'll talk about in a bit. Rush is just a little bit of a preview. It just gives you increased movement speed. That's it. Battle Rage does give you 33%. So usually buffs come in 25 or 33 percent values, basically 1/4 or 1/3. So most buff effects cap at 33%. So move speed. I should clarify. Move speed and attack speed cap at plus 33%. So if you have like a 25 and another effect giving you another 25, you'll hit 33% increase. So it does give you kind of the max standard cap. There are some skills that can exceed those caps. We'll talk about them whenever it is that they end up showing up. But Battle Rage is okay, but you really have to build around it. A couple of downsides from it. First of all, you do have to get those first few hits in to get it going. It does allow you, like, gaining double adrenaline from your attacks is a huge benefit because it means that you'll build up your adrenaline significantly faster. Like, it's hard to explain exactly how much of an impact that has, but basically all of your skills are charging twice as quickly. It is taking up your elite slot, however, which makes it a bit awkward to use. Yeah, the fact that the icon shows the dude wielding a sword, it looks like, is no mistake. Sword tends to be most flexible in elites just because axe and hammer elites tend to be so good, just generally speaking, that you're going to use them before you go to elites outside of their respective lines. Whereas swordsmanship, like there are some good elites in there, but especially when the game first came out, there's like one elite and it was like okay, but not amazing. You generally would not use a swordsmanship elite, and even now, like it's totally viable to not use a swordsmanship elite. Or it feels freer to do so than with the other two weapons. So Battle Rage, though, is fine. It gains your adrenaline more quickly, but the downside of having to build around not being able to use non-adrenal skills or losing the thing is pretty significant. And the other thing is most of the time you want to have access to a stance that increases your attack speed. You want to increase attack rate. While increasing movement speed is good, especially against enemies that are running away, often enemies aren't fleeing at the first sight of you coming up to attack them. So I generally want to be able to increase my attack speed more than I want to be able to increase my movement speed. Of course, increasing both is ideal, but this skill, in other words, like it's fine, but it's definitely a build around, and it's a little bit narrow in that regard. Berserker Stance. 5 energy, 20-second recharge. Stance. For 10 seconds, you attack 33% faster and gain 50% more adrenaline. It ends if you use a skill. So this is a charge-up move. You charge yourself up for 10 seconds, and then you can unleash. But it's a 1 for me. So, the big problem, it does not have 100% uptime. I usually want my attack speed increases to have 100% uptime, but it's 50% uptime. The other thing is, while gaining more adrenaline is great, ending if you use a skill is not. That's very restrictive. So if it didn't have that, I would actually probably give it a 3. But with that ending, if you use a skill, is just it tanks it completely. If it had some other effect that made it so I was okay not using skills, fine. But yeah, as it is, it's just not doing business. Body Blow. 7 adrenaline, melee attack. If this attack hits, target foe takes plus 34 damage, which is a lot. If that foe has cracked armor, they suffer from a deep wound for 12 seconds. This is kind of like a sort of eviscerate. It works with any melee weapon, but really only if you're a warrior. This, however, is still a 4 for me. It gives you have to put in some work to get cracked armor going around, but it's usually a good idea to put in that work. And plus 34 damage, like 7 adrenaline is a little on the higher end, but it's reasonable. And plus 34 is a lot of damage. So this is just very solid, very strong. In general, I'm happy to run Body Blow. So, that gets it a solid 4. Like, other things will definitely push it off bars, but if I'm a warrior, there's a good chance that I'd at least be happy to run this. It's competing at that sort of 4 tier. Bull's Charge. 5 energy, 20-second recharge. Elite Stance. So elite is a significant part of this skill. For 10 seconds, you move 33% faster, and if you strike a moving foe with a melee attack, in melee it says, that foe is knocked down, and it ends if you use a skill. Ending if you use a skill is a huge detriment. I already mentioned that with Berserker Stance. Being an elite is a huge detriment as well. That said, this skill is probably a 2 for me. It is very good in the situation where you're trying to line back because it lets you chase them down and it lets you knock them down every single time you hit them. It's very, very good in that situation. It's a very narrow situation. And if this were not elite, I would consider running it a little bit more. But again, ends if you use a skill is a huge downside. So that's something that's going to keep me from using this a lot of the time. The effect is powerful, but the downsides are strong too. So the downsides, of course, being elite and ending if you use a skill, and only having 50% uptime. Those are all pretty big downsides against it. So just some stuff to keep in mind. Bull's Strike. This is very good in PvP. 5 energy 10-second recharge melee attack. If this hits a moving foe, you strike for plus 25 damage, and your target is knocked down. So this is a snare. It knocks down a foe. Snaring, just referring to disrupting movement. It strikes for a decent amount of additional damage. This is, like I said, a very good skill in PvP. It is much less exciting in PvE. The effect that it's doing is just one that's just less important. So I give this, for kind of my purposes, probably a 3. It's not bad in any stretch of the imagination. Like, it does a useful thing in PvE, but it's going to be outclassed. Like, I just don't have a good reason to use it most of the time. So, Burst of Aggression. This is a 5 energy, 12-second recharge stance for 8 seconds at 12 strength. You attack 33% faster. When this stance ends, you lose all adrenaline. So this is much better than Berserker stance because you can power out a bunch of skills. This one's good in certain circumstances. I probably give this a 2, though. The reason why I'm giving this a 2 is while I like it in specific builds, a really good example of that is I like it on a dagger build that I run on my other warrior. It doesn't have 100% uptime, and losing all adrenaline when the stance ends, regardless of how it ends, is a huge downside. So you better make good use of the 8 seconds you got going with it. The reason why it works so well on a dagger build is because that build is not based on adrenaline, it's based on energy, and using another elite skill and strength, which makes the downside of this skill kind of go away, which makes it significantly better. So that's kind of how it is with that one. Charging Strike. 5 energy, 5-second recharge, elite stance. For 8 seconds, you run 33% faster. Your next successful melee hit does plus 34 damage, and the stance ends. The stance ends is if you use a skill. So that way you can't stack a skill with the plus 34 damage, probably. This is an interesting one. This is basically trying to figure out how to implement a charging attack in this game. It makes you run faster for a little bit, and the next time you hit a foe, you get a bunch of plus damage. I would run this at like half the plus damage if it weren't an elite, but the fact that it's an elite is a huge downside. Giving up your elite slot for this really tanks it. It's still probably a 3 for me, but I would even consider running it on like Assassin or something if it was in Tactics instead of Strength, but the fact that it's in Strength is just really crushing for it. I could see if it were in Tactics, I'd give it a 4, and if it were not an elite and had less damage, I'd still probably give it a 4, but as it is, it's probably a solid 3. Like, it's a fine skill. It's just elite is just a really huge downside. Counterattack. 5 energy, 6-second recharge, melee attack. If this attack hits, you strike for plus 29 damage. If you hit an attacking foe, you gain 5 energy. So it refunds its energy if you hit a attacking foe. As you can see, this has a really solid plus damage on it. 6-second recharge is fine. This is a very much so a 3. It does a very solid thing, but like it gets outclassed by basically everything. Or it gets out. That's wrong. It gets outclassed by a lot of stuff. I'm okay with running this on my bar. I just basically always have something I'd rather run. So I rarely dip into a counterattack. But it is a little bit higher than a number of other skills, to be clear. So it definitely is more likely to show up than some of them are. The energy refund is a big part of that. Defy Pain. 5 adrenaline elite skill. For 20 seconds, you have an additional 258 health, an additional 20 armor, and you take 8 less damage. They have a little bit of a double negative there with -8 less damage, but it reduces the damage you take by 8. That is applied post-armor calculation, by the way. So the plus 20 armor also reduces damage by square root of 2, I believe. Yeah, it reduces the damage you take by square root of 2 multiplier. So that's roughly 30%, 30, 25. What was it, like 0.7 something for a square root of 2? Anyway, the point being, that 20 armor does reduce damage some. This makes you super tanky, but this is a 2. The effect is super, super, super duper strong if you want that effect. The chances that you want that effect are probably pretty low. This game does not have an aggro taunt system. You can't taunt enemies. You can't force enemies to attack specifically you. And that makes Defy Pain very narrow, very questionable. The fact that it's kind of a unique effect and very strong at that, for doing what it does, bumps it up to a 2 from a 1. If I want this effect, I'm going to want this skill. I just never want this effect. That's the skill's problem. Again, the issue being that... and I should add, actually, the 258 health comes in on the bottom, so you'll basically like instantly gain 258 health. It's kind of like a temporary heal in that regard as well. But it also means that you lose the health off the bottom. So if you only have 258 health left when this ends, boom, you're dead, sort of thing. Or you might go to like 1 HP and be susceptible to 1 attack or whatever. But yeah, so, but like Defy Pain just makes you super tanky. It's just this game, you're not able to effectively be super tanky. Or you're not effectively able to tank because like you can't hold aggro. So that's the weakness of the skill. It's made for a different game where you can hold aggro. And that's not this one. Disarm. This is a weird one. So this is 5 energy, half-second activation time, 20-second recharge. So it goes very quickly. Like, this goes off very, very quickly. However, it is a sword attack. You have to use a sword to use this skill. Sword has this weird thing where there's, like, sword skills, like skills that require sword, in both strength and tactics. So, Disarm is a sword attack. It interrupts target foe's action. If that action was an attack skill, all of that foe's attack skills are disabled for 2 seconds. So this is an interrupt that you can only use with a sword. And if they were using if they were attacking, then it disables all their skills. What's significant about that is it will drain all of their adrenaline. That said, for me, this is a 1. I don't bring this skill. If I want an interrupt, I'll bring something else. Disabling all of the foe's attack skills is much more relevant in PvP than it is in PvE. Like, it'll help, don't get me wrong, but you're generally dealing with enough enemies and like having enough throughput and stuff where it just doesn't matter that much. So this skill is just, it's awkward to bring with you. I would rather bring a different interrupt if I'm going to bring an interrupt. The fact that it requires sword is whatever. And yeah, the effect of disabling their attack skills for 2 seconds, basically for draining all of the adrenaline from their attack skills, is just not relevant. Doliac Signet. This is a signet, so it only has a recharge, this signet basically activates kind of like a stance, but it's not. It's got a 20-second recharge. It doesn't have any activation time, as a signet has no cost. Signet, for 18 seconds, you have plus 34 armor, and you cannot be knocked down, but your movement speed is slowed by 75%. This is a 2. It's not quite a 1, because the effect is very strong. Like, it makes you, again, this is the problem with the skill. It makes you a super tank, but this game does not really reward being tanky in the same way that other games do. So plus 34 armor is almost halved damage, right? Because halved damage comes at every 40 armor. And being able to not be knocked down makes you really hard to stop. The problem is you are snaring yourself badly. Like, cripple is only 50% slowdown. This is 75. So this really slows you down. You basically can't go anywhere. You're at 25% movement speed. You're not getting anywhere while this is going on. And because it's a signet, you can't even cancel it. So that's actually kind of a downside. It might be bumped up to a 3 if this were a stance, oddly enough. So yeah, this is the sort of skill that you're really annoyed whenever the AI uses it and you never use yourself because it's just not good enough. Like, that's the sort of skill that this is. But hey, the effect is really strong if you're looking for that. Dwarven Battle Stance. 5 energy, 20-second recharge, elite stance. For 10 seconds, if you are wielding a hammer, note, wielding a hammer, you attack 33% faster, you gain 40 armor, and your attacks interrupt and your attack skills interrupt foes when they hit. So this makes all of your attack skills interrupts, which is strong. This actually combos really well with Staggering Blow at 4 adrenaline and quick activation time. This is a 2, though. This is a build around me. You can build around running this. First of all, you need to be bringing a hammer. It is an elite, though, so you're giving up whatever elite you would be running otherwise, and only has half uptime. If ArenaNet were updating the game today, they're not. Like, they're not doing skill balancing or anything right now, as far as I'm aware. I would totally make it that way at, like, 13, 14 strength. This is at, like, 20, 21 duration, so that way you can have 100% uptime if you're really dumping into strength and hammer mastery. But the fact that it's only 50% uptime is rough. However, it does make you super tanky and makes you attack faster and allows you to have all of your skills be interrupts, which is all very useful. I believe this made just attacking interrupt at one point in time and it was nerfed, but it's a build around that kind of needs to be a little bit better. You can do it with some PvE only skills that allow you to get stance duration up doubled, and that would allow you to be able to roll this. But yeah, it is what it is. Okay, Endure Pain. This is a 2. So to explain what it does, it's 5 energy. It activates instantly. It's 30-second recharge. Skill. For 16 seconds, you have an additional 258 health. Basically, Defy Pain is kind of like an elite version of this, but not at the same time. Defy Pain you can keep up permanent, like, as long as you have enemies to attack, you can keep Defy Pain up because it's adrenaline-based. Endure Pain is not, but because it doesn't require adrenaline, it's actually very useful when you're doing what's called running, which is where you're going from one outpost to another without defeating enemies. You're just trying to get from one zone to another. Usually, the way that's typically worked is you ferry people. Like, it's a service. They pay you in-game currency, and you take them to a spot. So the most common place of doing that, actually, or kind of like the most popular one, is to run from Beacon's Perch all the way down to Drockner's Forge. As the Drockner run. That run is kind of the biggest one because Drockner's Forge is the first place you can get max level armor in Prophecies. I think that run has died down a lot. It does actually also let you short circuit a lot of the Prophecies campaign. That becomes a lot less significant when you consider that as soon as you get to Kryda, you can activate the Asturian Gate and like go to Eye of the North where you can buy max level armor, or even when Factions came out, you could do some quests in LA to go to Kaineng City and get max level armor. So that run was still useful for quite a long time, but kind of became less and less useful as time went on. So it's useful in that if you're like getting hit by a bunch of stuff to give you a sudden quick boost of survivability. Because like keep in mind, this is like plus 50% max HP. Like, and that's like healing half of your health when you use it. So it does make you like super way more durable for a period of time. But mostly this is a skill that enemies annoy you with by using. Enraging Charge. 5 energy, 20-second recharge. Stance. For 13 seconds, you move 25% faster. Enraging Charge ends when you successfully strike a target, at which point you gain 2 strikes of adrenaline if you hit with a melee attack. I think you might be able to use skills with this. This is a nice opening move, but the fact that it ends when you hit is a little eh. This is around... I'm going to give this a 3. It could be around a 4, but this is a skill that I just often don't bring. Generally, I'm going to want my stances to increase my attack speed. I can only have one at a time. This works okay with that. This is a fine skill. It's just... usually I'm going to want to bring something else. So... It's okay. It's simply okay. Flail. For adrenaline stance for 12 seconds, you attack 33% faster, but move 33% slower. So this is a bit of a self-snare. This is a... I do like this skill. There's basically... you do have to get a couple of hits in before you can start using it. But almost all of the increased attack speed stances in Warrior come with downsides. So Burst of Aggression, for example, causes you to lose all adrenaline. This one makes you slower. We'll look at a couple of non-attribute ones that have other effects, or they're like an elite or something. So this one's fine. It's probably a 4. I like this better than some. You do want to cancel stance, however, such as rush or sprint, which are, or enraging charge. But rush and sprint are increased movement speed stances that you can use to end this stance and start moving more quickly again. Enraging charge is nice with this because you can use it to close the distance to an enemy, hit them, get a bunch of adrenaline, and start flailing. So flail is solid because its downside is fairly manageable, and it requires adrenaline for increased attack speed, which can lessen energy burden elsewhere. Now we have Flourish. Flourish is 5 energy, 1 second activation time, 8 second recharge. It is an elite skill. All of your attack skills become recharged. You gain 6 energy for each skill recharged by Flourish. Note that this is like 1 or 2 energy if you don't have any strength. That's a pain in the butt for me to get to. But Flourish is questionable. The reason is this isn't useful with adrenaline skills because your adrenaline skills typically don't have any recharge. However, this is actually usable by secondary, if you're a secondary warrior. If you're like a ranger or an assassin, both of which have a bunch of, like, they don't use adrenaline, right? So all of their attack skills are energy skills. Then you can use Flourish. It will probably pay for itself and recharge all of your skills. 8 second recharge is relatively low. I'm generally not going to use this on a warrior. It does get a 2 because it is a bit of a build around me. You can try to build with it in mind. But just keep in mind that its effect actually works a little bit better, even if you're not gaining a bunch of energy from it, for the recharge effect on Ranger and Assassin. I think a Flourish Assassin actually makes a lot of sense because you can get your combo reloaded very quickly with Assassin, especially if it's a chain that has some longer recharge skills. However, it is an elite, which is a big downside, and you are assigning your elites to it, so probably not running this on a primary warrior, however, because it's super awkward on a primary warrior. Yeah. Griffin Sweep and Leviathan Sweep are the same skill. I talked about them a little bit earlier. These are 3s to me, both of them, so I'm just going to give them 3s. So they are 5 energy, 8 second recharge, melee attack. If it hits, you strike for plus 17 damage. If this attack is blocked, your target is knocked down and suffers 29 damage. This is similar to Irresistible Sweep. It deals similar damage. The knockdown hits a little. The damage on knockdown hits a little bit harder if it's blocked. But I just generally don't want this effect. Like, it's okay. It's not a bad skill. A little bit long on the recharge. I usually want my attack skills to be 5 or fewer second recharges. Maybe 6. But it's okay in that regard. It's just the plus damage on the front end is a little bit low. Plus 17. And usually I'm going to want something that, again, to end whatever's causing them to block. Not just doing this. But, like, this isn't terrible. If you know you're going to an area where there's going to be a lot of blocking, it's not the worst thing you could do. So they're okay. They're just, again, all of my 4s and 5s I'm going to want to pick above them. Headbutt. This is a very expensive elite skill. 15 energy, which is a lot for warrior. Keep in mind that warrior energy pool by default is 20. So this is like 3/4 of that. Speaking of 3/4, that's the activation time. 3/4 second activation time. 20 second recharge, which is kind of long. Elite skill. Target touched foe takes 88 damage. You are dazed for 17 seconds. Okay. This is a 2. It's a build around me. You generally do not run this for the damage. 88 damage is nothing to sneeze at. It's armor ignoring because it's just straight damage, right? So 88 damage is nothing to sneeze at. But you becoming dazed for 17 seconds, the purpose of that is to combo with necromancer skills that allow you to transfer conditions from you to others, so that way you can pass this dazed on. This is awkward. It's a thing you can do, but it's a very inefficient way of getting dazed. And further, something that really tanks this skill, A, it's a lot of energy. You're spending more energy for the skill to get rid of the dazed from you onto a foe to make it worthwhile. And on top of all that, you're really hoping that the AI healers you have with you don't remove the dazed from you before you can transfer it. That's a pretty big if. That, like, you're either skimping on condition removal or you're trying to manually control it, at which point you're multitasking way too much. Or is this just going to be unreliable? Technically, it has an arrow build around purpose, so it definitely deserves a 2, but, like, as an elite and all that, like, this is too fiddly to bother with. Leviathan Sweep is next, but I already talked about it with Griffin Sweep because they're the same skill with that whole factions thing. So that brings us to Lion's Comfort, which is a pretty solid skill, actually. It's 4 adrenaline, 1 second activation time, 1 second recharge. It's a skill. All of your signets are disabled for 12 seconds. You are healed for 98 health, and you gain 2 strikes of adrenaline. The signet disable is probably because there's also Healing Signet, which is a signet that heals you in tactics. It disables that. I don't quite know why it disables signets otherwise, but it's just kind of an odd clause that's sitting there, and I think it's for Healing Signet. So this heals you for a decent amount. 98 health is roughly a fifth of my maximum HP with all my runes and everything. Default maximum health is 480, so and you might run more strength. Gaining 2 strikes of adrenaline is really nice. It's why this skill has a recharge, so that way it doesn't fuel itself. That probably bumps up pretty quickly to 3. Yeah, as soon as I go up to 13 strength, it bumps it up to 3, which is very solid. This skill is definitely a 4. Lion's Comfort is just really a solid skill. It gives you a bit of healing. It gives you a bit of additional adrenaline gain. It's stuff that you want to do. So, very solid. Mage Hunter Strike. 5 energy, half second activation time, 3 second recharge. Elite melee attack. So you can use this with any melee weapon, but it is an elite. So it takes up your elite slot, which is very important. If this attack hits, you strike for plus 17 damage. If your target is under the effects of an enchantment, this attack cannot be blocked. So the quick recharge is really nice, but you're going to burn through your energy with this. Keep in mind, at 2 pips of energy regeneration, you're regenerating 1 energy every... What is it? It's 1/3 energy per second, so per pip. So that's 2/3 per second. So 1 energy every, what? 1.3 seconds or something like that. So with 3 second recharge, it maybe is sustainable to use, like you'll fully recharge. But if you have any other energy costs, like the plus damage on this is not that high. This is mostly a follow-up for spikes, and a lot of your strong spike skills are going to be elites, so it's in a really awkward spot that way. The unblockable, if they're enchanted, is a nice rider, but it's a bit finicky. This is a... I don't know. I feel like this is probably a 3. It's usable. It's not quite a build-around, but it's not stellar. Like, I wouldn't hate running it, but I'm not going to choose to run it, basically, ever, so it kind of just sits there. Power attack. 5, like this is a super simple move. 5 energy, 3 second recharge, melee attack. If it hits, you strike for plus 34 damage. This is, however, is, you guessed it, another 3. It does a lot of plus damage. Energy is kind of high, just because you are, I mean, again, 3 second recharge. I kind of feel like it's nice to have it available. This is fine. The thing is, just like Mighty Blow, it doesn't have any additional effects. So I basically don't bring it because I usually want my skills to do more than just plus damage. However, for just plus damage, this does so very efficiently and very effectively. So it's maybe worthy more consideration than I usually give it, but it's just very unexciting. So I'm usually bringing something that does a little bit more. That's really all I can say about it. Primal Rage. 4 adrenaline, 10-second recharge, which is very awkward. It's an elite stance. For 12 seconds, you attack 33% faster and move 25% faster, but you take double damage. This is basically trying to be an elite version of Frenzy, which we'll talk about later. It's no attribute. Frenzy, just briefly, increases your attack speed, but also causes you to take double damage. Taking double damage is from any source, so spells will deal double damage to you, armor ignoring skills deal double damage to you, everything will deal double damage to you, which is fine if you're being ignored. You definitely want to cancel stance with something like this, though, because the instant you're being hit, you want to be able to end it. The fact that this takes up your elite slot is dicey. I'm not a big fan of this skill. I'm going to give it a 3 because it is strong, but like, I don't think you're wrong for running this by any means. I think it is stronger in PvP than PvE. I think in PvP, in PvE, it's somewhat risky. I mean, it is in both, obviously. But generally, warriors don't tend to be as much of a focus in PvP because the other players are going to be targeting casters in the back, usually. That tends to be the focus. And melee attackers are generally not as much of a focus. In PvE, because you tend to enter battle first, because the AI is usually lagging behind you when you're wielding a melee weapon, you're going to receive the initial salvo. Of course, it takes a little bit for this to get going. The 10-second recharge is a bit awkward on this as well. It's fine, but I'm generally never running it. I'd actually generally prefer Battle Rage over it, if you remember that way back up here. Battle Rage does not have the recharge, and it makes you run faster, and you don't get the attack speed buff, but double adrenaline is extremely powerful as well. So I generally pick that over Primal Rage. So, but I think it's probably worth getting a 3 because I do think it is solid. Protector Strike, 5 energy, half-second activation time, 3-second recharge, melee attack. If this attack strikes a moving foe, you strike for 34 more damage. So some of these skills are inconsistent. I don't have the concise descriptions on, so sometimes you get some flavorful descriptions. This is kind of like a different version of Mage Hunter Strike in terms of general stats. It's a 3, I guess. I don't... The quick activation is really nice. Dealing more damage to moving foes is good, but it's just a little bit awkward, and generally I'm wanting something else in PvE. I don't have a whole lot to say about Protector Strike. The skills that target moving things sound really reliable because it's like, oh, foes are going to be moving all the time. And to some extent that's true, but they're actually less reliable than you would expect. I don't think this is a garbage skill. I think it's worth having a bit higher than that, but it's definitely a bit of an awkward skill and probably a little bit stronger in PvP than PvE. Rage of the Ntuka. I don't know. NT is not a syllable pairing you see. It's a Nightfall skill named after an enemy in that. 5 energy, 15-second recharge, elite skill. Gain 6 strikes of adrenaline for 10 seconds. Whenever you use an adrenal skill, that skill recharges for 5 seconds. This is a 2. This is a build around me. I do think this skill is actually a little bit better than it looks on the tin, but it's definitely a build. You are bringing this with the intention of charging up all of your skills, using them, and then using this again to charge them all up. It basically front loads them, and it kind of makes all of your adrenal skills act like energy skills, sort of. It's an okay build. It's not the best or anything, and you are spending your elite slot to give you a different cadence. It's questionable how much it's worth that. Rush is for adrenaline stance for 18 seconds. You move 25% faster. I don't bring this a whole lot, but this is fine. This is a perfectly fine skill. Honestly, it's probably a 4. I don't necessarily bring it a whole lot, but it's a skill that's kind of, I think about and is like in contention and things like that. So I think Rush is probably worth being a 4. Being able to just keep yourself moving faster is useful. Again, I do tend to favor increase attack speed over increased move speed, particularly in PvE. But, you know, it's a fine way of moving faster, and it certainly lasts a long time. You can definitely keep it up and all that sort of stuff, so it's a fine skill. Shield Bash. 5 energy, 20-second recharge. Skill. For 10 seconds, while wielding a shield, No, you have to be wielding a shield, which means it does not work with hammer because hammer is two-handed. You cannot wield a shield and a hammer at the same time. The next attack skill used against you is blocked. If it was a melee skill, your attacker is knocked down, and that skill is disabled for an additional 15 seconds. Oh man, if this was tactics, it would be so much better. As it is, I think this was tech and PvP for like wrecking assassins' days, but this is just so narrow. I feel like it's a 2. I don't think it's quite bad enough for a 1. I don't think you're quite building around it per se, but it's definitely better than what I think of a 1 being. It's not that bad. Like, the effect is strong. It's just, I don't want it, usually. Signet of Stamina. So this is a signet. It has a quarter-second activation time, 20-second recharge. It's a signet. You have plus 250 maximum health. This signet ends if you successfully hit with an attack. I'm going to give this a 1 because the only time I'm ever using this is when I'm running. And that's the only time I would ever use this. And I don't run very often. Not these days. So, yeah. This skill ending when you hit with an attack and being in strength means that only warriors can really use this to any effect, and warriors are going to want to hit with attacks. The only time that this skill is useful is when you are for some reason on a warrior that is not trying to attack things. The only time that happens is when you're running. Therefore, this skill is only useful while running, so going from one part of the map to another. In that narrow case, I would actually use this skill. I would never use it otherwise. It doesn't do an effect I have any need for. That's that. Signet of Strength, a 1-second activation time, 45-second recharge. Signet, your next 13 attacks deal plus 5 damage. I don't know if this is armor ignoring or not. That's something I should check into. Regardless, I'm going to give this a 3. It's fine, but I'm usually not going to use this. Like, it's an okay self-buff. It's just unexciting. And just, yeah, it's just not worth bringing most of the time. Not a whole lot more to say about it. If you are trying to build around Symbolic Strike, which we will get to much later, this is a choice you can use. Boy, this is a long episode, ain't it? I kind of knew these would be, though. So, yeah, I mean, it's fine, but it's unexciting. Sprint. 5 energy, 15-second recharge. Stance for 13 seconds. You move 25% faster. This is a 4 for me. The reason this is a 4 is because it's solid. It does exactly what you want it to do. It does what it says on the tin. You sprint, right? It doesn't have 100% uptime. That's okay. The other thing is this lasts about 7 seconds without any attribute spec. So this is actually a skill you can use on with a warrior as your secondary on something other than a warrior primary. It's not like the ideal choice necessarily if you have other options, but it's good enough if you need an increased movement speed skill to actually use this without any spec in it. So, like, in terms of increased movement speed skills, yeah, this one's fine. This one's pretty solid. I think of this as kind of the default, as it were. Tiger Stance. 5 energy, 20-second recharge. Stance for 9 seconds. You attack 33% faster. Tiger Stance ends if any of your attacks fail to hit. So this is a solid 3 for me. The effect is fine. It doesn't really matter that it ends if any of your attacks fail to hit, whether that's because you're blind or they block. Those are usually going to be the occurrences that happen. If you are using, notably, a bow, for example, your attacks may fail to hit if they stray from your target, which can happen. I'll talk about that more when I talk about rangers, though. The biggest issue with this skill is it has a 9-second duration and 20-second recharge. You just can't keep it up all the time. So I don't bring this as an increased attack speed buff, just because of that. The downside of ending if any of your attacks fail to hit is not a huge deal because, let's face it, it doesn't really matter how fast you're attacking if your attacks are not hitting. So that's just not a huge deal. So it's a fine skill, but just fine. Warrior's Cunning. 10 energy, no activation time, 60-second recharge. Skill. For 10 seconds, your melee attacks cannot be blocked. This is a 2. If you're going into an area where you know you're getting blocked a lot, you might want to bring this. In general, I would rather bring something that gets rid of whatever causes the blocking. So a really good example of that is Wild Blow, or bringing characters with enchantment removal or something. But you can bring this. I think it's a little bit better in PvP if you want to like make sure you get a spike chain off. But yeah, it's narrow. But hey, if you want to make sure your attacks can't be blocked, this will do it. It is a lot of energy as well. 10 energy is very high for Warrior. Warrior's Endurance. So this I gave as an example of a 2, so you already know that it's a 2. 5 energy, 30-second recharge. Elite skill for 29 seconds. You can get it up to full uptime with higher strength. You gain 3 energy each time you hit with a melee attack. Warrior's Endurance cannot raise your energy above 22. Obviously not a huge deal when warriors typically cap their energy out at 20. This skill is super narrow. Note it only works with melee attacks, but this is a way to use daggers successfully with warrior. So I do use on my my other warrior. I like to run a dagger build on her with warrior's endurance and some 5 energy dagger skills and zealous daggers. It works out fine. You get 4 energy back on each hit, and because the last hit of a we'll get to this when I talk about assassin a month from now or something. 2 months, whatever it ends up being. But because the last attack in an attack chain for assassins is usually 2 hits, you will gain more energy back, and just a couple hits will recharge your energy. You could run this on warrior and run it with things like power attack, but that's usually overthinking it. I would generally run this more often with daggers. I guess you could also run a flourish dagger dagger warrior. But anyway, Warrior's Endurance works really well for that, but generally I'm not going to run it otherwise. It's effective at that specific thing and kind of narrow in other applications. Okay, this brings us to Swordsmanship. Lets me put my attribute points there. And okay, so Swordsmanship, again, just as a reminder, swords tend to focus around bleeding, particularly gash is the reason why. But they also have a little bit of a cripple theme, which we'll see pretty quickly. Okay, the other thing that sword has as a weird sub-theme is like a not being in a stance. Like it has some weird stance-related themes as well. Okay, so Barbarous Slice is 6 adrenaline sword attack. If this attack hits, you deal plus 25 damage. If you are currently not in a stance, you also inflict bleeding for 13 seconds. This is a pretty reasonable way to inflict bleeding, except you're probably going to want to be in a stance, because you're probably going to want to be in an increased attack speed or movement speed increasing stance. That makes this okay. It's probably a 3. Like, it's either a 2 or a 3. It's a 2 if you see this as a skill where you're particularly building around not using a stance, and it's kind of a 3 otherwise. It's a fine skill, but think of it as a high 2. This 3 is a high 2. I definitely will lean on it in certain circumstances. So, for example, if I am specifically running a sword dervish with Onslaught, Onslaught is an enchantment that increases your attack and movement speeds, in which case I'm not using a stance to do it, and Barbarous Slice becomes significantly better there. On a warrior, Barbarous Slice is pretty questionable, just because you're going to want to be using a stance a lot of the time. That takes a lot of the wind out of the sails of the skill. That said, plus 25 damage is pretty solid, so, you know. Crippling Slash. 6 adrenaline, elite sword attack. If this attack hits, target foe is crippled for 13 seconds and begins bleeding for 22 seconds. This kind of combines both things. This is a 3 to me. Again, bleed is not the most exciting thing. Technically, this deals 6 times 22 damage, which is like 132 damage or something off of bleed, but it does so very slowly. This is much more for the crippled. And it's okay, but using your elite slot on this instead of on actual raw damage is a bit unlikely. I think it's, again, another one of those skills that's a bit stronger in PvP than PvE. Dragon Slash. This one, interestingly enough, is going to get a 2 from me. So, Dragon Slash, first of all, you really want more than 12 swordsmanship to use it, but 10 adrenaline, elite sword attack. If Dragon Slash hits, you strike for plus 34 damage, which is a lot, and gain 4 strikes of adrenaline, which is also a lot. So, once you get going, the skill kind of pays for itself, and it combos extremely well with a shout in no attributes called For Great Justice. For Great Justice gives you a temporary period of gaining double adrenaline. Needless to say, gaining double adrenaline means that Dragon Slash, especially with enough spec in swordsmanship to get the strikes of adrenaline you gain from it up to 5, I think even the 4 might work, allows, like, it instantly recharges itself. So you can just keep spamming this for plus 34 hits every single attack. That build is very strong. Dragon Slash without that build is okay. So I'm generally not going to bring it because that initial investment of 10 adrenaline is just so high that getting to it is a giant pain in the rear end. But if you get there, it's very good. And if you're running that specific build, that's a Dragon Slash For Great Justice build. It's very powerful. So, yeah. Final Thrust. 10 adrenaline sword attack. Lose all adrenaline. If Final Thrust hits, you deal plus 32 damage, and the damage is doubled if your target was below 50% health. I'm not sure if this applies to just the 32 if it goes up to 64, if it doubles the damage from the attack. I think it doubles the damage from the attack, but I'm not actually positive. This skill can hit very, very hard. It's really good for ending an attack chain. It has one problem. It's 10 adrenaline. That bumps it down to a 3. It could potentially be a 4. But the fact that you lose all adrenaline, part of that final thrust part, and the fact that it costs 10 adrenaline to use just prices it a little too high. I'd rather bring something like our next skill over final thrust most of the time. Our next skill being Galrath Slash. Yeah, it's simply way too expensive and cumbersome to actually use a lot of the time. It's not bad, but it's not what I call good. I will, however, say that this skill inspires me a lot when I'm working on other things. So from that standpoint, as a design, it's really interesting. Just because the effect of, hey, this skill is a skill that you specifically use to finish off targets. And it combos well with You Will Die and stuff that can gain you some additional adrenaline on weakened targets, but it's just priced so high that it's really awkward to get to. Galrath Slash actually does have a clone of Silverwing Slash. They are both 8 adrenaline sword attacks that deal plus 32 damage. That's all they do. This is super vanilla. This falls in the same sort of category as like Mighty Blow or whatever. These are 3s. They're kind of high 3s just because sword is a bit narrower of a weapon in terms of the skills it has available. Like, it has a lot of really weird, quirky skills. So just like raw, ideal bunch of plus damage actually kind of gets more play in sword than it would in other with other weapons. But it's an awful lot of adrenaline. The damage is there, but it's just not exciting. Gash. 6 adrenaline, sword attack. If this attack hits a bleeding foe, you strike for plus 17 damage and inflict a deep wound for 17 seconds. So this is kind of... I mean, this honestly gets a 4, maybe a 5. Probably a 4. I'm going to use this most of the time I use a sword because this is how sword gets its deep wound. Although, honestly, Body Blow is probably better. Body Blow hits harder, always does its plus damage, and cracked armor can be applied to anything. Because this relies on a bleeding foe for getting deep wound in sword, and keep in mind, Body Blow was introduced later in the game, Gash came in the very first game of Prophecies. But the restriction of bleeding, which, again, a painfully large number of enemies are immune to. A lot of the undead are skeletal and immune to it. Elementals tend to be immune to it. So there's just... Those are a surprisingly large number of enemies that you end up facing in the game. So Gash really looks pretty bad in a lot of circumstances. Keep in mind that Axe has much more reliable ways. Like Dismember just straight up inflicts deep wound. And you can get it off of Hammer with other... off of Weakness, which can be applied to everything. And Knockdown, which can be used on most enemies, but not all. Gash is kind of like a staple skill on Sword, but it's also emblematic of what makes Sword kind of the weakest of the three weapons. So, Hamstring. What can I say about this? It's 10 energy. It's 15-second recharge, sword attack. If it hits, your target is crippled for 13 seconds. So, the most interesting thing about this skill is that it shows up in a build jokingly referred to as Hamstorm. I think I actually have it in a template somewhere. If I really wanted to dig for it. It's not a good skill. Actually, novelty. It's probably under novelty. Yep. So, Warrior Elementalist Prophecy box Hamstorm. So, if you look on the box, the box that the game shipped in for Prophecies, this bar, I don't know how well you can see it. Let me drag this over a bit, because I do have the rubric sitting up there on your screen, not mine yet. This build is atrocious. Warrior should never run this build. It is split, like you can see there, it is split among like 5 different attributes. The skills are not especially synergistic. Like, it's literally running 3 elements from Elementalist. Those are 3 different lines. And a tactic skill, a strength skill, and a sword skill. So it's like 6 attribute lines that this is spread across. That's just way too thin. But you can see Hamstring's on there. So Hamstorm is jokingly referring to running Firestorm, which is an area of effect fire magic spell that enemies like damage over time. It basically creates an area where damage happens every second. We'll talk about it when we talk about Elementalist. And then I'll give it a solid 3 probably. But Hamstring features in that build as it's a joke build. It's not a real build. The energy is not there for it on Warrior. Hamstring is basically a skill that I'm going to give a 1 because, let's face it, 10 energy is very expensive on Warrior. Only crippling is kind of mediocre. 15-second recharge is long. If I want to inflict cripple, I'm going to do it with a different profession. Probably Ranger. Possibly something else. Like, if I'm going to snare stuff, I'm probably, honestly, going to be using Elementalist snares or Mesmer snares, not cripple anyway. But if I am, it's probably going to be inflicted by a Ranger. Crippling Slash is a better choice. Hamstring is just, it's awkward, it's clunky, it's expensive, it takes a long time to recharge, it does not do any additional damage. I would rather just run faster than make my opponent go slower. That's more reliable. Cripple can just be cured off of enemies anyway. This is not worth it. This is a bad skill. At 5 energy, it would be okay. If it did a little bit of plus damage at 5 energy with like a 10-second recharge, it'd be solid. But as it is, it's just not... It's not there. 100 Blades. This is an interesting skill in that it changed. At one point in time, it was an attack skill that did adjacent area of effect twice. It was basically like a double Cyclone Axe. That was real good. It was also the only elite sword had at the time. But 100 Blades is a 5 energy, 25-second elite skill. For 15 seconds, whenever you attack with a sword, all adjacent foes take 22 slashing damage. Slashing damage like this does care about armor, so it will be reduced by armor. That said, this does get reliable repeated AoE, which is not bad. This is probably a 4. I'm happy to run 100 Blades. It does not have 100% uptime, but it does dramatically increase your damage while you use it. And if you have anything that can increase the number of foes you hit, it can really go crazy. Sword itself does not have anything like that. So one of the things that's a damage to sword is none of these skills hit in an area of effect. You have to go to a PvE only skill to be able to get that with sword, and that's something that hurts it. 100 Blades helps with that a little bit, but it's also the sort of skill that super benefits from something like that. So that's just really awkward for sword. Also, our next skill is Jaisenju Strike. It is the exact same skill as Pure Strike. Again, Factions pops its head in and says, hey, I'm going to give you a duplicate of a skill for no good reason. Jaisenju Strike's not even that amazing of a skill, but we'll talk about it. Yeah, 100 Blades, by the way, like I said, solid skill, happy to run it, but it's an elite, it's competing with other stuff, it's fine. I run it some amount of the time that I use a sword. But anyway, Jaisenju Strike and by proxy Pure Strike are 5 energy, 8-second recharge, sword attacks that strike for plus 24 damage, and if you are not using a stance, it cannot be blocked. These skills are solid 3s for me. I'm going to use them in circumstances where I know there's going to be a lot of blocking going on, but 8 seconds is a little bit long on recharge. I'd prefer it to be 6. Not using a stance to get the unblockable is a little awkward, but again, a lot of the time that doesn't matter. Plus 24 damage is solid. They're fine. Honestly, Mighty Strike is probably better most of the time. So these are kind of low 3s, and like if Mighty Strike is a 3, which I think it was. Yeah, Power Attack. That's the name. Excuse me, I was getting it wrong. Power Attack. A Power Attack is a 3, and I'm not going to bring that a lot of the time. These should definitely not show up a lot of the time, too. They're not stellar. Knee Cutter. 5 Adrenaline, 1 second recharge, Sword Attack. If it hits a crippled foe, you gain 6 energy and 3 strikes of Adrenaline. The 3 strikes of Adrenaline is why it has recharge, so you can't just spam it. The 1 second of recharge prevents the self-gain from happening. This is a 2. You can bring it if crippled is happening. Again, I probably would not be doing that if inflicting that crippled with a warrior, but you can bring this and inflict crippled and you can bring this if you're inflicting crippled on things to be able to gain energy and adrenaline. That's okay, but the biggest problem with this skill is all it does is it helps you. It doesn't do anything against your foe, and 5 adrenaline for that privilege is kind of high. If this was 3 or 4, or had some additional effect, or was less conditional or something, this would be better, but it's just, as it is, this is very narrow, and the effect is going to require very specific builds to actually want this. So I don't know what build that is. That's part of why it's not great. It's not great at all. Pure Strike I talked about already with Jaisenju Strike. So that brings us to Quivering Blade, which is probably a 5. Quivering Blade is one of the better sword elites. It's 5 Adrenaline, elite sword attack. If it hits, you strike for plus 34 damage, which is a lot. If it hits a moving foe, that foe is dazed for 5 seconds. So this is kind of like a better cleave. It costs 1 more adrenaline, but for 8 more damage or something, it's a lot more damage. This actually hits really hard. And the bonus of dazing moving foes is nice. That doesn't come up again. The moving foe restriction is a pretty big restriction. It's bigger than you think a lot of the time. But it's there, so it's a nice bonus. That's a bonus. Most of this is a 5 adrenaline plus 34 damage attack, which is just very solid. Particularly for sword elites. I know that there's a little bit of a discrepancy where I would consider this something substantially better than Power Attack, which, if you remember with Power Attack, it's also plus 34 damage. What makes that elite better? The adrenaline. It's really an adrenaline thing. But maybe I'm undervaluing Power Attack, and that could be the moral of this whole evaluation, is that I'm undervaluing Power Attack. But anyway, I like Quivering Blade. That's all I got to say about it. The energy does matter, though, because Warrior Energy Pool... Warrior Energy Regeneration does go low very quickly. So, Savage Slash. This is the skill that I was alluding to when I was talking about Disarm earlier. Savage Slash is a skill I much prefer using. It's 5 energy, half-second activation time, 15-second recharge as opposed to 20. Sword attack. If it hits, it interrupts their action, and if that action was a spell, you deal plus 32 damage. I still don't really generally bring this. It's probably a 3, pushing a 4, but 15-second recharge is, again, fairly long. And I'm generally going to be leaning towards other things. But this is a solid utility skill to bring on a sword warrior. So, it's fine. But a lot of the time, interrupting is not something I'm doing with a warrior anyway. It's probably something I want to do with a mesmer more often, maybe a ranger. Being a melee interrupt is kind of awkward because that means you have to actually be in your opponent's face. And so you have a lot more flexibility to interrupt what you want to interrupt if the opponent is... or if you're using a ranged attack like a ranger with a bow, or if you're using a spell like a mesmer. So that makes Savage Slash, like... It's fine for a warrior, but the problem is a warrior's not usually wanting to do what Savage Slash is doing when I'm using one in PvE. So, yeah, that's kind of where that sits. Seeking Blade. 5 energy, 4-second recharge, sword attack. If this attack hits, you strike for plus 16 damage. If it is blocked, your target begins bleeding for 25 seconds and takes 16 damage. This is a 3. The damage is not that great. Again, I'm beginning to think I need to evaluate power attack more highly as I kind of go through a lot of these. But the thing is, I just don't think to bring power attack a lot of the time. I don't bring Seeking Blade a lot of the time either, though. The if blocked clause is okay, but as I've stated, bleeding is not a great reward. This is a very long-lasting bleeding, but a little bit of 16 damage is not exciting, as just like they take 16 damage and begin bleeding. So this is not really like the recharge is nice, but Pure Strike is better against blockers, is all I'm saying. Sever Artery. Okay. So this skill is probably a 4. Sadly enough. This is the cheapest, most reliable form of bleed for sword. It is kind of a standard sword skill. Sever Artery Gash. Again, this is part of why sword's bad. All this skill does is inflict bleed. Bleed is damage over time. Technically, this is 6 times 21 for 126 damage. Plus 126 armor ignoring damage sounds great. But the thing is, when that takes 21 seconds to apply that, it's not so great. You can easily do that much damage in a much quicker period of time. So this is mostly for enabling Gash. And Gash is really the only bleed payoff in Sword. And bleed, again, is ineffectual against huge swaths of enemies. It's, again, not uncommon to find non-fleshy enemies that this does absolutely nothing against. So, yeah. It's not great, but if you're trying to do the Gash thing, which you probably are with a sword, then Sever Artery is one of your better ways of setting it up. That's just how it is, unfortunately. Silverwing Slash is a skill I already covered when I talked about Galras Slash. Because it is the exact same skill, it is a 3. A high 3, just because sword is so sad. Standing Slash is probably much higher. So Standing Slash is 6 adrenaline. It hits for plus 17 damage, and an additional 17 damage if you are in a stance. Breaking with the tradition of hating stances with swords. I don't know why. Sword. So one of the things that we've seen as we've been going through Sword, and I don't think it's going to improve with the last 2 skills, is that Sword is super all over the place. It doesn't know if you like stances or hate stances. It doesn't know if it's it has minor rewards for cripple and bleed. Bleed rewards a little bit stronger, but there's only one of them. If you looked at the other ones, there were probably 4 or 5 skills at least that were if you've deep wounded a foe, we do a thing. Hammer had several skills that were if you've knocked down a foe, we do a thing. And at least 1, maybe 2, if you've weakened a foe, it has at least 2. If you've weakened a foe, I do a thing. The only payoff for bleed is Gash, and the only payoff for crippled is Knee Cutter. It's got skills spewed into other attribute lines. We saw the one in Tactics. and we'll see, or we saw the one in strength, excuse me, and we'll see another 2 in tactics. And on top of that, like, it's super inconsistent. What does sword do? It doesn't, its theme is like all over the place. And that lack of focus actually is a detriment to it, because it's not really saying this is what sword is about. And it ends up meaning that certain things are preferable with sword over others. And it's just, on the one hand, that means that you're using sword in a bunch of different spots. On another, it means that it doesn't have an identity. It doesn't have a very clear identity. And the identities it does have tend to be a little on the weaker side, because bleeding is a weak condition that doesn't get applied to a lot of enemies. A substantial enough number of enemies to actually matter in PvE. So, standing slash itself is a 5, like I said. Because I'm usually using an increased move speed or increased attack speed stance, which means that this is plus 34 damage on 6 adrenaline, which is really good. So, there we are. Standing slash. Probably my most used sword attack. Yeah, it's just solid plus damage. Steel Fang Slash. 8 adrenaline, 1 second recharge, sword attack. If it hits, you deal plus 25 damage. If you hit a foe that's knocked down, you gain 4 adrenaline. Again, what's with these knockdown rewards outside of hammer? This one is at least questionably better than... No, this one is better than the axe one. This one is a 3. Because plus 25 damage is solid, I guess. But the gaining 4 adrenaline is a much, much better reward. Actually, I'm making it 2. Because you do have to build around being able to get the hit on a knockdown to make the skill worth using. So that's a strong build around. It just looks good in sword because sword is like mediocre and schizophrenic in terms of like not having a clear identity. So, yeah. I basically never use Steel Fang Slash just because the knockdown requirement is very high. But it's worth considering. Sun and Moon Slash. 8 adrenaline, sword attack, attack target foe twice. These attacks cannot be blocked. Fun fact, when evasion was still in the game, one of the attacks could not be blocked and the other could not be evaded. So that was fun. This is a 4. I often do bring this one. It is notably useful if you're doing something that buffs your weapon. So there are, in Elementalist, there are enchantments that you can use to give you plus additional damage on an elemental weapon. So, for example, Conjure Fire. If your weapon deals fire damage, to Conjure Fire deals an additional, like, 17 damage or whatever. 15, 17 damage, somewhere in that range. That hits both times with Sun and Moon Slash, so it works really well with that. It works really well with 100 Blades. It is high in adrenaline costs. The additional armor penetration from strength is nice. It's solid, which is what sword desperately wants, so that's kind of where things are. Let's go ahead and look at tactics now. So tactics is mostly a lot of utility stuff. Keep in mind that these can be used by non-warriors, so that's a significant note. Our first skill is Charge, which is 5 energy, 20-second recharge, elite shout. All allies within earshot. So keep in mind that is the bubble right here. So it's a pretty good range. Lose the crippled condition, and for 11 seconds, they move 33% faster. Fun fact, the lose crippled condition is a more recent addition, relatively speaking. It did not originally, was not originally part of the skill, but it needed to compete once Paragon stuff started happening. This is a 4 for me, which might seem really high. And to some extent it is. But the reason why is if you have 2 members of your party using this, now this is costing them their elite slots, so that's a big cost. But if you have 2 of them using it, it allows your entire party to be able to, because you can have 10 and get 10-second duration on this, 10 spec in tactics. And this allows you to be able to keep increased movement speed up on your entire party, which greatly improves travel time. There is a Paragon skill that competes with it. However, the advantage of Charge is that this works in combat. The Paragon skill does not. The Paragon skill is fallback. That one you don't need quite as much investment to get the full uptime, if I recall correctly. Actually, let's... Where is this at? 8. Yeah, 8 is a little bit low. You want at least 9. But the fact that this works in combat is super beneficial because the fallback ends if you hit with an attack, I think. So that's really bad for attackers. So this is a really good way of being able to increase your movement speed among your entire party and still be able to use on your physical attackers increase attack speed stances, which is significant for like Warrior, for example, in particular. So this is actually pretty high for me just because of that. And when I bring charge, I often bring the next skill, Fear Me. Fear Me is 4 adrenaline, 6-second recharge. It's a shout. All nearby foes lose 3 energy. That helps put pressure on their energy pools, which can make them collapse more quickly. For 12 seconds, your melee attacks gain plus 25% chance of a critical hit against stationary foes, so if they're not moving. So the lose 3 energy, like I said, it applies pressure. Pressure is where you're trying to wear down their resources, and what ends up happening with it is it looks like you're not accomplishing anything, but what you're really doing is you're wearing down their healer's ability to keep them alive, and when you've drained their healer's energy pools, which Fear Me accelerates, and anything else that's trying to like stop you from doing things, they suddenly crumple. The additional crit chance does add damage. This is a 4 for me, though, just because I do tend to bring it with me a lot when I am bringing charge on something. So Fear Me is a skill that often ends up on my bars because the effect is generally useful. Like I said, the additional energy pressure does help collapse enemy healers more quickly because I tend to be very tight on energy. And losing 3 is a pretty substantial blow. And the additional crit chance is nice. I may be overvaluing it a little bit, but that's how things go. None Shall Pass. Good old Lord of the Rings reference. This is 5 energy, 45-second recharge, shout. All nearby foes that are moving are knocked down. This skill recharges 7 seconds faster for each foe knocked down for a maximum of 25 seconds. I believe that's 25 seconds faster. I'm going to be honest. This is... This is probably a 2. The reason why it's a 2 is because I don't think it's quite bad enough to be a 1, but I don't think it's quite good enough to be a 3. This is a non-build around me 2. The effect sounds stronger. First of all, it's nearby foes, not earshot. So while it is a pretty big range, it's not that big of a range. Knocking them down is strong, but I basically don't bring this. I think the effect is relatively powerful, but it is a long recharge. Yes, it does get quicker if you knock things down. It's more awkward to use than you'd think, but the effect is theoretically powerful, so I'm giving it a little bit better. But I don't ever really use this, so that's kind of why it ends up where it does. Retreat is next. 5 energy, 20-second recharge, shout. If there are any dead allies within earshot, your party moves 33% faster for 10 seconds. Retreat's a 1. Okay, so... First of all, I'd rather bring charge or fallback than retreat. Retreat does not have 100% uptime. It doesn't end if your party member so if you can activate it, it doesn't end. But generally, so this is the type of skill that you use in a bad situation. It's very similar to I Way without the benefits. I would actually consider running retreat on an I Will Avenge You build, just because they combo together really well. This moves you faster. I Way makes you attack faster and gives you a bunch of regen. They both require a dead ally. But the problem with retreat is you don't want the situation where you have dead allies. And I think the upside of this is weaker than the upside of I Way. So I think this is a bad skill because the situation in which you want to use it is a situation you want to avoid. You don't want to bring skills that you never want to use, and retreat is a skill you never want to use. There are times when you want to take into account that your allies will be dead, and there are times when you want to bring skills based on that fact. Those skills are called resurrection skills, because you want your ally to not be dead. All retreat does is allow you to run faster. What are you going to do? So the problem with this skill is the effect is not the effect that you want when you have a dead ally. And it's an effect that you want when all of your allies are alive, and you don't want the situation that makes it work. So it's just not great. Shields up. 10 energy, so it's a lot of energy. 30-second recharge. Shout. For 10 seconds, you and all party members within earshot gain plus 60 armor against incoming projectile attacks. So I'm going to give this a 3. The effect is actually very, very strong. So projectile attacks would include all wand and staff attacks because those are projectiles, as well as bow and spear attacks. That's actually a sizable number of attacks, a sizable number of sources. Plus 60 armor is going to reduce something by like 2 root 2. So dividing all damage by 2 times the square root of 2 is pretty substantial. You're over halving damage, right? That's the thing, is you're reducing damage by more than half. So that's a huge benefit. So I definitely would be happy to use this. You're going to run into a lot of times where you're being wanded, where you are being attacked. It's just going to decrease that sort of low level pressure. But the caveat to this is a lot of the time there are better things that you can be doing. So solid effect, happy to run it, but most of the time there's something better. But it's a nice support skill. To the limit. I mentioned this one earlier. This one's probably a... Yeah, I'm going to say this one's a 5. It's maybe a little high. It might be a 4, but I think I'm going to roll with 5 here. Because if I'm running tactics, I'm often going to want this as well. So it's 5 energy, 15-second recharge, shout. For each foe within earshot, maximum of 5, you gain 1 strike of adrenaline. For 18 seconds, your maximum health is increased by 50. The maximum health increase is a nice little benefit. What's really useful about this is because it's a shout that's applied to you, it works for skills, and we'll see them later. They're called soldier skills under Warrior, that have a benefit while you're under the effects of a shout. So To the Limit allows that to be something that works. So that's very, very good. And gaining adrenaline like this is very useful in the opening of battle. This can gain you up to 5 adrenaline at 12 points like this, which is super useful. It's very, very, very good. So, yeah. This is just a very solid skill. You want it a lot of the time. It's a useful side buff, and the initial effect is really strong. You want your skills to be charged at the beginning of battle, and this does that very, very well without being an elite, which is really nice. Victory is mine. Poor Victory is mine. So this is 5 energy, 15-second recharge. It's an elite shout. You gain 56 health and 6 energy for each condition suffered by target foe. This is a 2. It used to be probably a 3, but it's a 2. The reason why is Rangers, funnily enough. So, history with this skill, there is a Ranger trap build. We'll see what traps are when I talk about Rangers. But it was a PvP build where Rangers would basically walk up to a group of enemies, plant something called a trap in melee range. Traps inflict a lot of conditions. They'd use Victory is Mine. Basically, the way Victory is Mine worked is this effect would apply to all foes like around you. I forget the range that it had. But when it affected all foes around you, if you are spreading a bunch of conditions on a bunch of foes around you, you could gain a huge amount of health and energy and be super resilient, refill all of your energy. It was very powerful. So powerful, in fact, that it got nerfed because of Rangers. This is only really useful in a situation where you are inflicting a lot of conditions on something. I would definitely consider running it on a warrior secondary more than a warrior primary. The effect is strong if you're able to get a bunch of conditions on something. But yeah, this is just too narrow to really be that useful. That's the problem with it. Watch yourself. 4 adrenaline, 4-second recharge, shout. Party members with an earshot gain plus 21 armor for 10 seconds. This shout ends after 10 incoming attacks. Okay, so funny fact, this did not used to have a recharge nor an end after X attacks. It used to just apply the effect for a period. Watch yourself is easily a 5. This is very effective. Plus 21 armor to your entire party is, again, decreasing damage. Like, it's a square root of 2, right? 20 armor is square root of 2. 40 armor is divided by 2. So this is divided by the square root of, or yeah, whatever. It's decreased by a square root of 2 multiplier. So it's a huge benefit to the like overall survivability of your party, because it does decrease damage across everyone if it's damage that respects armor, to be clear. So Watch Yourself is just a very good staple sort of skill. Auspicious Parry, 1 adrenaline, which is very cheap. I think this is the lowest adrenaline cost of any skill in the game. 2-second recharge. Elite Stance. For 8 seconds, the next attack, so any attack, skill or not, against you is blocked. You gain 3 strikes of adrenaline when this stance ends. So, when it says the next attack against you is blocked, that means that the stance ends when it blocks that attack. So this can actually gain you a lot of adrenaline. It leads to a very interesting sort of play pattern. I would actually position this as a 2, I think. It's maybe a 3, but I feel like 2 is more appropriate. This effect is kind of wonky to use. It does make you weirdly tanky in a way. It only works if enemies are attacking you, which, I mean, happens, but it kind of charges up your adrenaline. It's kind of awkward, kind of clunky. The effect is kind of strong. It's fine. It is a stance, however, and that makes it also awkward, but you can work with it. Yeah. Blocking attacks to gain adrenaline is not bad. Activating with only 1 adrenaline is pretty strong. It will charge itself if it takes longer than 2 seconds for you to be attacked. So, yeah. Balanced Stance, 5 energy, 30-second recharge. Stance, for 18 seconds, you cannot be knocked down, and you do not suffer extra damage from a critical hit. From a critical attack, it says, but whatever. This is not the same thing as ignoring crits, so you can be crit, it just doesn't act like a critical hit. That's what it sounds like. I don't know if it's just you can't be crit, or if it actually does exactly what it says on the tin. This skill is a 2 for me. It's a high 2 in that this is really, really good in the situations where you know you're going to be getting knocked down, where you're going to be afflicted by knockdown skills. Generally, it's better to just suffer the knockdown and just deal with it and move on with life. This is very useful in the Drachner's Forge run, because there are areas where there are enemies that just spam knockdowns, and you absolutely need this to avoid that. So it's really good if knockdowns are a problem. If knockdowns are not a problem, it's not worth bringing. The crit line is just irrelevant. So yeah, it's pretty narrow. But hey, it's a really good counter if knockdowns are getting you down, literally. Bonetti's Defense, named after Bonetti, who was a boss monster. I think you can still find him in post-steering Ascalon. But anyway, 8 adrenaline stance. For 10 seconds, you have a 75% chance to block melee and projectile attacks. You gain 5 energy for each successful melee attack blocked. It ends if you use a skill. Okay, this is all right. It's not amazing. There are other defensive stances that I prefer over this one. 8 adrenaline is very high. It does last 10 seconds, which is nice, lengthy duration. The gaining energy when you block a melee attack is nice. 75% block chance, by the way, is standard block chance for things that block for a duration. So there's stuff that one-shot blocks, like Auspicious Parry, that guarantee block. But for something that blocks for duration, 75% is totally standard. So this is fine from that standpoint. The fact that it blocks both melee and projectile attacks is fine. This is probably I don't know. I'm really torn about where to put this. I feel like it's a 3. Ending when you use a skill is really bad. That's what's challenging this for me. I could see using this on like a caster, where you wand to gain your adrenaline. You just attack somebody with your caster weapon. And that's fine for gaining adrenaline. Then you could use this to defend yourself and potentially gain some energy back. But the fact that it ends if you use a skill is pretty harsh. I still think it probably deserves a 3. just because I feel like it's effective enough. It is a lot of adrenaline. In the situation where you're using like a caster or something, you're not spending adrenaline on anything else probably, so it's okay. It seems fine. But I'm usually not bringing this. Deadly Riposte. 5 energy, 10-second recharge, skill. For 8 seconds, while you have a sword equipped, you block the next melee attack against you, and your attacker is struck for 75 damage and begins bleeding for 21 seconds. This is a pretty decent skill. If you're using a sword, you have to go into tactics for it. This is one of the 2 skills I was mentioning. The others are Riposte down here. They are, as you'd expect, somewhat related. I give Deadly Riposte... I'd probably actually give it like a 3, I think. It's close to a 4, actually. But I think I give it a 3 just because I like regular Riposte better, so that one probably narrows this one out. Because regular Riposte costs adrenaline, whereas this costs energy. The bleed is nice for sword. The fact that it only works on melee attacks is kind of significant, but 75 is a substantial amount of damage. Regular Riposte is a little bit weaker in general. But again, the adrenaline as opposed to the energy is a substantial difference. So it's a fine skill. I don't fault anyone for running this one at all. But the fact that you have to use a sword and be in tactics as well and all that does mean that there's additional requirements to use it. And the 10-second recharge is notable. Yeah, it's fine. Defensive Stance. Okay, so this is 5 adrenaline, 8-second recharge. I should actually mention Deadly Riposte could be okay on a spellcaster that is using a caster's sword, but that's like suspect. Anyway, Defensive Stance, 5 adrenaline, 8-second recharge. Stance, for 4 seconds, you have a 75% chance to block melee and projectile attacks. When Defensive Stance ends, you gain 1 strike of adrenaline for each melee attack skill you have for a maximum of 3. This one is a solid 4 for me. This is probably, of the defensive stances, this is probably the one that I'm going to use most often. The benefit of gaining adrenaline when it ends for your melee attack skills is really nice because it kind of plays into building those up. 5 adrenaline's all right. It mostly serves to take the heat off of you for a little bit, to give you a chance for the casters to stabilize you. 4 seconds is not super long. It'll probably block a couple of attacks from like 2-3 attacks from a single attacker. But the fact that it refunds you some adrenaline is certainly nice. So if I want a defensive stance is generally be my choice. The other one is potentially going to be deflect arrows. This one's more useful if you don't have melee attack skills, I think. This is 5 adrenaline, 12-second recharge stance. For 5 seconds, you have a 75% chance to block attacks. If you block a projectile attack, note it does block melee attacks as well. If you block a projectile attack, adjacent foes suffer from bleeding for 13 seconds. The main reason why I would consider using this over defensive stance if I don't have melee attacks is this has a slightly longer duration and the bleed does anything. It's not amazing, but deflect arrows is fine. I'd also give this one a 4. I like it well enough. I definitely pick either of these over Bonetti's defense, for sure. Okay. It is nice that there's a little bit of an option for slightly nuanced differences as well. Nuanced differences. Desperation Blow. So this one and Drunken Blow are the same skill, again. That's something that happens because of factions. I don't know why. Okay, so these are 5 energy, 7-second recharge melee attacks. If they hit, they strike for plus 34 damage, which is a lot, and they randomly inflict deep wound for 20 seconds, weakness for 20 seconds, bleeding for 25 seconds, or crippled for 15 seconds. So there's 4 different conditions there, deep wound, weakness, bleeding, and crippled, that they randomly will inflict. After you land this attack, you're knocked down. Both of these are solid 2s. They're solid 2s and not 1s. They would be 1s except you can build around them. There's specifically a build with them and another skill that we'll see later called Steady Stance that Desperation Blow and Drunken Blow work well with. But they're both pretty unreliable, and outside of a build that specifically working with them and trying to turn the knockdown disadvantage into less of a disadvantage, I'm not bringing these guys. Yeah, I would basically, if I'm not able to take advantage of knocking myself down, there are better options. That brings us to Discipline Stance, which is 5 energy, 15-second recharge stance. For 3 seconds, you gain plus 10 armor. That's not a whole lot. It does a little bit, but not a whole lot. And you have a 75% chance to block attacks. It ends if you use an adrenal skill. Given that it only has a 3-second duration at 12 tactics, that ending clause is not a huge deal. In general, this feels like a skill for a caster to be like, I need to relieve the pressure on me for a little bit. This is a 3 for me. I usually won't bring this. There are cases where I will, but most of the other defensive stances are in general preferable to disciplined stance. It's just a little bit too short of duration, a little bit too long of a recharge. If it got up to like 5 seconds at 15 tactics, I would actually consider running it a little bit more often. The adrenal thing, again, I would not tend to run this on a character that has adrenaline skills. This is more for like a caster or maybe an assassin or ranger or something. Ranger probably not, because ranger has its own options that are probably superior. But it's okay, but not. It's not a release valve that I'm going to be wanting a lot of the time, so it's rarely going to be able to fit on bars, if that makes sense. Drunken Blow I talked about when I talked about Desperation Blow, because it's the same skill, so that brings us to Gladiator's Defense. Gladiator's Defense is a 5 energy, 30-second recharging elite stance. The elite is what dooms it most of all, I think. For 10 seconds, so it does have a healthy duration, you have a 75% chance to block incoming attacks. Whenever you block a melee attack this way, the attacker suffers 29 damage. This skill has a special place in my heart because it was part of an early farming build that I did for farming griffins. This was way back in the day, a very long time ago. But you'd bring Gladiator's Defense, the griffins would attack you and kill themselves on it. So it was very effective in that situation. But otherwise, it's not the most exciting skill. I give it a 3. I think it's fine. It's perfectly usable. If it wasn't an elite, it would probably still be a 3. Honestly, maybe a 4, just because it would actually be a lot more usable then. But it's a solid skill. It's fine. Healing Signet. 2-second cast time, 4-second recharge is a signet. Again, no energy cost or other cost. It is a signet. You gain 154 health, so it's a very strong heal. 154 is pretty meaty heal. You have minus 40 armor while using this skill. That minus 40 armor is really interesting. The way that works is it has no effect on skills that don't care about armor. But it basically doubles all the damage you take from sources that do care about armor. Because again, minus 40 armor is double damage because every 40 armor is a 2 multiplier on damage, either halving or doubling. So again, 160 armor is 1 multiplier, half multiplier at 40 armor, quarter multiplier at 140 armor. If you could get up to 180, it would be an 8th multiplier. You're not getting up to that much armor. But if you could. I guess you could if you really wanted to use some skills. But anyway, Healing Signet, interestingly enough, I actually give a 2 to. The reason why is because it is a very situationally useful skill. As a warrior, you generally are not healing yourself. Your casters, your specific dedicated healers are healing you. Healing Signet is a dangerous skill to use to heal yourself while you're taking damage because of minus 40 armor. That makes it very risky. You're probably, if you're going to want to bring a self-heal, as a warrior, you're actually way better off using Lion's Comfort. It doesn't heal as well or for as much, but it has better benefits and does not have the minus 40 armor effect. Where you want to use Healing Signet is either as a runner, because you're not gaining adrenaline, or other sort of situations where you're kind of getting by yourself. But actually, this is a skill that I just generally don't recommend using most of the time, just because, in honest fact, as a warrior, your job is not to heal yourself. That's your caster's job. That said, you can devise builds where you want it, so it's not like completely worthless or anything. But it's just not amazing. Protector's Defense. 5 energy, 30-second skill. 30-second recharge. It is a skill, not a stance. For 10 seconds, allies adjacent to you have a 75% chance to block incoming attacks. Protector's Defense ends if you move. That is what dooms this. If it did not end when you move, then I would probably give it a higher rating. As it is, I'm actually going to give this guy a 1. The reason for this is twofold. One, it ends when you move, so it's very hard to have AI use, because AI, like heroes and stuff, generally are going to find times to move. They might use it okay, but I would be a little surprised if they did. So that makes it really awkward. It's probably best on some sort of warrior secondary. You would have to use it yourself, and in that case, it's just very awkward. You'd have to spec a lot into tactics. You're trying to do something kind of strange. You can't move while using it. The not being able to move while using it is really what sinks this skill a lot. Allies adjacent to you is a fairly narrow range as well, so you have to bunch up, which is bad against spells. So, yeah, overall, this skill is just not doing a whole lot for me. If it worked while you moved, I would actually probably give it a 3. But it doesn't, so never mind. Riposte. Okay, Riposte is 4 adrenaline skill for 8 seconds. While you have a sword equipped, you block the next melee attack against you, and your attacker is struck for 68 damage. This one I said I'd probably give a 4 to, and I think I do. If I'm using a sword and I'm in tactics, I probably want Riposte. The effect is pretty useful. Striking your attacker taking, again, 68 is a healthy chunk of damage. The fact that it's 4 adrenaline means that you can get this up pretty regularly, probably roughly every 5 seconds or so, which is more often than Deadly Riposte. The bleed on Deadly Riposte is just not worth it. A lot of the time you're intentionally inflicting that with another skill because it's unreliable. So the damage of Riposte is the cost of Riposte and the lack of recharge is preferable to what Deadly Riposte does. So yeah, you block the next melee attack against you. Like, this is a solid skill. Shield Stance. 5 energy, 15-second recharge stance for 5 seconds. While using a shield, you have a 75% chance to block incoming attacks. And damage is reduced by 2 for each rank of strength that you have. Maximum of 15 damage reduction. This makes you super tanky for a little bit. Interesting fact, this used to reduce your movement speed, I believe, while it was active. But obviously that's been changed. So I actually consider this skill to probably be a good solid 3. I don't usually use this. It might rank a little bit higher. It might be worth a 4. I'd actually tend to use this even on a secondary warrior more than Discipline Stance, just because it lasts longer. And otherwise, it functions more or less the same. But you do have to have a shield. That's a pretty big commitment. But it does make you really tanky. So this is a really solid option for a defensive stance as well, if you want one that uses energy. So I would actually consider using this if it wasn't that the other things existed and I liked them better. That's kind of the downside for this one. Shove. Shove is 5 energy, 3/4 second cast time, 15-second recharge, elite skill. Target touched foe is knocked down. If that foe is moving, that foe's stance ends and they take 63 damage before being knocked down. This is a 2. It's a build around me. It's fine. It's not great. It's not awful. But it's not quite 3 territory because it's an elite. If it was not an elite, it'd probably be a 3 to a 4. It'd probably actually be a 4 if it wasn't an elite. But the fact that it's an elite takes up your elite slot really hampers it. I would probably rather run Shock over Shove for a knockdown effect. Shock being an elementalist skill that's somewhat similar. We'll talk about it when I talk about elementalist, and I'll talk about how it's so much better on everything but an elementalist primary. But yeah, Shove is, if you're building around the knockdown, it's fine. The other effects are just kind of nice, I guess. But again, that moving clause is not as easy to get as you would think. So, Here we get the soldier skills. These 4 skills all have one thing in common, which is that they have additional benefits if you are under the effects of a shout. So soldier's defense, 5 energy, 15-second recharge stance. For 5 seconds, you have a 75% chance to block attacks while under the effects of a shout or chant. You gain 1 strike of adrenaline for each blocked attack. So this one's a 2. The reason it's a 2 is because it's a build around me. It'd be a 3 otherwise. But the thing is, that block effect, you only get the effect if you are under the effects of a shout or chant. Now, a chant is another type of thing. This is for Paragon synergy. Shouts and chants are analogous sorts of ideas. So this works if you're, for example, under 2 the limit or watch yourself, or charge, for example. But in general, I'm not bringing this. I would rather bring something like shield stance and deal with that, or defensive stance. Defensive stance lasts a similar period of time and has better upside. This one is not awful, but like it's very narrow because of the shout or chant requirement. Gaining adrenaline for each blocked attack is nice. I can see builds where I'd want to run this, but they're very specific narrow builds. So that's what earns it a 2. Soldier speed, 5 energy, 12-second recharge stance. For 15 seconds, you move 15% faster. You move an additional 15% faster while under the effects of a chant or shout. So this one has really good uptime, which is a huge benefit, but still a 2. I'd rather use another move skill that is consistent. However, the other problem that this has is one of the shouts that I tend to use most often is charge, which makes the skill completely worthless. I'm not going to bring an increased move speed stance when I'm also bringing in an increased move speed elite shout. There's just no reason to do that. So yeah, this one's a big sort of tank. It just is not great because of that, but there could be circumstances where this is fine to use. Notably, it might actually be reasonable on like Paragon secondary or something like that. But here we are. Soldier stance, 5 energy, 15-second recharge, elite stance. For 13 seconds, you have a 75% chance to block. You attack 33% faster while under the effects of a shout or chant. So this one is an elite, which is a huge downside. That said, it does give you a good chance to block, and the increased attack speed is really nice. It probably deserves a 2 just because it's a build around, but the thing is, it's a build around that I actually find myself doing with some frequency. Yeah, I'm going to give it a 2. I wouldn't really use this without being under the effect of a shout or chant, but under 1, I definitely would give it strong consideration. So if it's solid in that sort of build, the fact that you can use it pretty well on a secondary is also really nice. It's actually probably better on Paragon than on Warrior, funnily enough, just because keeping yourself under the effects of a shout or chant is easy enough with either, and Paragons want this effect a bit more than Warrior does. But it's definitely a build around. Soldier's Strike. Melee attack. It's 5 energy, 4-second recharge, and if it hits, you deal plus 34 damage. If you are under the effects of a shout or chant, this attack cannot be blocked. This one's fine. I'm going to give this one a 3. The reason I'm giving this one a 3 is being under the effects of a shout or chant is only a minor benefit. You get most of the benefit of the skill regardless of the 34 damage, so it just kind of feels like it deserves that. It's a perfectly serviceable skill. The anti-block clause is nice, but doesn't really matter that much. This brings us to Steady Stance. So Steady Stance is a solid 2. You'll see why in a moment. It's 5 energy to activate, 6-second recharge. It is an elite stance. Takes up your elite slot, is a huge deal. For 10 seconds, the next time you would be knocked down, so it ends when you would be knocked down. It replaces it. You gain 3 strikes of adrenaline and 6 energy instead. So this skill combos with specifically Drunken Blow and Desperation Blow. You can use this and then one of those, and it refunds your energy and gains you some adrenaline. It's a questionable build, but it is a thing that you can do. I believe there might be a no attribute skill called grapple that we'll be looking at that may or may not work with this. We'll have to see. But yeah, this is not a skill that I consider great. Using this preventatively for knockdown is very questionable and would have to be done with very specific areas where you know that that's happening and things like that. Thrill of Victory. 5 energy, 8-second recharge melee attack. If this attack hits, you deal plus 36 damage. If you have more health than that foe, you gain 2 strikes of adrenaline. This is a solid 4. Actually, it might even be a 5. And I'm going to give this a 5. The reason I'm giving this a 5 is because if I am in tactics, I'm often bringing this. Like, if I'm in tactics and a melee attacker, this is probably coming along with. Plus 36 damage is a lot. 2 strikes of adrenaline is a huge benefit. Overall, this is a very solid skill, and I'm very happy to bring it a lot of the time. Wary Stance. 10 energy, 10-second recharge. Stance. For 5 seconds... just Thrill of Victory is just really, really good. For 5 seconds, going back to Wary Stance, you block any attack skills used against you. For each successful block, you gain adrenaline and 5 energy. Wary Stance ends if you use a skill. This is a 1. Okay, it's 10 energy, which is a lot of energy. You can't use any skills while it's going on, and it only blocks attack skills. It 100% guarantees blocks attack skills, but it only blocks attack skills. You do gain adrenaline energy, a lot of energy, but it only blocks attack skills. This is not a good stance. This is not a good defensive stance. I don't run this. The only thing that I see run, okay, so granted, in the Crystal Desert, there are Minotaurs that use this, and it's mildly irritating. That's it. You just don't use any attack skills for a few seconds. It's over. You've built up your adrenaline, then you unload. It's not good. Okay, so that concludes the attributed, or skills with attributes. So this brings us to the no attribute skills. Actually, the PvE only skills might be first. So, okay, let's talk about these. So save yourselves. So there's skills aligned with the Kurzix or Luxons. It's the same skill regardless. They just have different icons and they scale with different tracks. So friend of the Kurzix or friend of the Luxons. The warrior one is called Save Yourselves. It's a friggin' solid 5. It is 8 adrenaline, shout, for 6 seconds. All other party members, so it doesn't affect you. It does not have earshot range restriction, however. All other party members gain plus 100 armor. This over-quarters the damage they take. From damage sources that respect armor. This is a hugely powerful damage reduction buff. It's insane. It is so powerful at reducing damage. It's probably going to reduce, you take a caster, they go up to 160 armor, right? They are taking less than a quarter damage, a fifth, a sixth, somewhere around there, damage that they would normally. The amount of damage reduction this contributes, it goes past armor caps and all sorts of things. It is incredibly powerful. It is PvE only. There is a restriction on PvE only skills that you can only have 3 PvE only skills on your bar at a time. But it's often worth bringing if you are going to be a warrior. It's worth bringing if you're going to have warrior secondary. There is an entire Paragon build called Imbagon, entirely based around keeping this up on your party as much as possible. This is an incredibly powerful skill. And, it's super, super powerful. The other one that we have is Whirlwind Attack. This is Sunspear. It scales with your Sunspear rank. This is also super powerful. It's 6 adrenaline, 1 second recharge for a very good reason. It's a melee attack, attack target and adjacent foes. Each attack that hits deals plus 20 damage. Plus 20 damage is pretty substantial. I second warrior to be able to bring this along. This is very good. This is also a solid 5. Granted, your heroes can't use it, but you probably should be using it a lot of the time. It's just superb. The 1 second recharges, that way it cannot refill itself on hitting adjacent foes. It works super well, though, with crude swing or cyclone axe to charge it up by hitting a bunch of things and then unleashing this. It works with any weapon. It works with scythes. It works with daggers as well. It works with any melee weapon. So it works with scythes and daggers as well as axes, hammers, and swords. It's super powerful. Yeah, it's straightforward. It's powerful. It's great. No attribute. Now, note that there are a couple of no attributes I'm not going to talk about. I'm not going to talk about Res Sig or Antidote Signet because they are not warrior skills. But we're going to go ahead and go through these as well. So we have Coward. So this is a 4 adrenaline, 2-second recharge elite shout. I have no idea why it has a recharge. I legitimately don't know. It feels a bit redundant. But if target foe is moving, that foe is knocked down. Okay. Say it with me. Moving restriction, way more prevalent than you think. This is a way of being able to try to control an enemy. I think it used to be fleeing, but that was like super narrow. This is already bad. It might be good at like 1 or 2 adrenaline. At 2 adrenaline, it'd probably be strong enough. But like, it's an elite. It takes up your elite slot. The effect is way more conditional than you think it is. Knocking them down when they're running probably isn't doing as much as you want it to. Frankly, this is a 1. I don't know. Like, I've tried to use this and been super unimpressed. It's not an elite skill I want to use. If it was not elite, and I might consider it, but even then, it's unlikely. It's just, it flat out does not do enough. It just does not do enough. I don't want it. So, here we are. It's a 1. 4 Great Justice, on the other hand, is a 4. It probably should be higher. Let me tell you what it does. 5 energy, 45-second recharge, shout. For 20 seconds, whenever you gain adrenaline, you gain 100% more, which is double for those who aren't familiar. This is very, very, very powerful. I don't bring it all the time. It's not useful if you don't have a bunch of adrenaline skills. It does have some very specific builds. As I mentioned, it combos super well with Dragon Slash. It allows you to build up your adrenaline a lot more quickly. Like I said with right here, Battle Rage, like it combos really well with Battle Rage if you use it first as well. But gaining double adrenaline is a very powerful effect. Do not underestimate it. This skill is very strong. It's one that I probably, like I said, should run more often. It's very, very good. On your knees, 6 adrenaline, shout. Lose all adrenaline. If any adjacent foes are knocked down, all of your stances are recharged. I'm torn between giving this a 1 and a 2. I'm going to give it a 2. With the caveat that this is super conditional. So you have to knock a foe down, and it recharges your stances. So this requires 2 things. 1, it requires you to not want to be using adrenaline because it drains all of your adrenaline. 2, so that was 0. 1, it requires you to be knocking down foes that are next to you because if any adjacent foes, so it does not work at a range. And 3, you need to have a stance with a long enough recharge that you want to use this to recharge it. That is all extraordinarily conditional. This is basically a 1 with the caveat that there might be some contrived build out there. You know what? I bet this is good with Dwarven Battle Stance because you're using a hammer, you're using a stance, the stance you want to keep up all the time, and it only has half uptime. You could probably use that. I would prefer in general to run Dwarven Stability, which allows you to double the length of your stances and not futz around with this shenanigans. But you could do this. I could also maybe see an argument for using this on a ranger, like on a hammer ranger with whirling defense to keep whirling defense up all the time. But yeah, this is very narrow, very hard to use effectively. You need to have a stance that you want to try to keep up a lot more than you're able to, and you have to be knocking down foes that are right next to you. That's a tall order. This ain't great. There's maybe a niche assassin build that uses it too. I don't know. I'm trying to figure out ways that you could use it. It is super much so a build around, and it's a very awkward one. But in the build that's the linchpin for, I guess it's good. I don't know. You're all alone. 5 energy, 10-second recharge, elite shout. If target foe isn't near an ally, that foe suffers from cripple and weakness for 8 seconds. This one's all right. This is a 3. I'm going to give this one a 3. This does what you want Coward to do better. It doesn't require you to have built up adrenaline, which means you don't have to hit anything. It cripples them for a period of time that lets you run up to them. Those are the things that you want Coward to do, that Coward doesn't do. However, if they're near an ally, it doesn't work. They have to actually be alone. Near is a pretty decent-sized AoE as well. It's, adjacent, nearby, in the area. So if you remember back to those rings, it's kind of close, but it's not that close. It definitely is something that you can use, but you have to be very situationally aware when you use it. In general, like, if it weren't elite, I would consider running it a lot more. But the fact that it's an elite is really, really, really hampering, because the effect is a bit finicky to actually bring as an elite. And I'd rather run other sources of snaring than this one. But, it exists. It actually also has, I should add, a benefit on a caster, where if you're being pursued by a melee attacker, you could use this to snare them and weaken them, so if they do catch up to you, they can't hit you as hard. The weakness might serve as a cover condition for cripple as well, so if you only remove one condition at a time, it removes whichever one's on top, and if that's a weakness, then it would remove that. All that said, I'm like, the fact that this is an elite really, 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 really hampers it. So that's probably the biggest thing that prevents me from considering running this on more things, and that's probably why it's an elite, because it'd probably be a little too good if it wasn't. But they could have just put it in tactics and made it not an elite and have the duration scale. So, I don't know. Here we are. That's what I would do to it to make it a lot more runnable. This has probably been the more interesting skill to talk about. Distracting Blow. 5 energy, half-second activation time, 10-second recharge, melee attack, swipe your weapon at the target, dealing no damage but disrupting the target's current action, and the actions of foes adjacent to your target. This is a 4. This is... So every single time I talked about interrupts with other attributes, like Disrupting Chop or Savage Slash or whatever, this is kind of the counterpoint. This only has a 10-second recharge. While it doesn't deal any damage, so it's not good for quick follow-ups, for like spike follow-ups, which is one thing that interrupt-type skills can be used for. The fact that it is an AoE interrupt with only a 10-second recharge is very good. If you want an interrupt on a melee attacker, this is a solid choice. Again, it's not for damage, it's for interrupting, and specifically for interrupting, but it's very good at that. So, that one's highly recommended. Distracting Strike is 5 energy, half-second, activation time, 15-second recharge, melee attack. If Distracting Strike hits, it deals no damage and interrupts target foe's action. If target foe has cracked armor, that skill is disabled for 20 seconds. This effect is mildly more powerful in PvP, where having a recharge increase is a lot stronger. The cracked armor is a substantial detriment. I'm going to bring Distracting Blow over this every time. I don't think this is a bad skill. I'm going to give it a 3 because of that. But just keep in mind that Distracting Blow in PvE is going to surpass this one every time, because having increased skill disable is substantially less important in PvE, and hitting an AoE with a shorter recharge is way more valuable. That said, if there are situations where you are inflicting cracked armor on everybody and want to potentially have a skill disable for additional, like, this does do that, but I'm going to want Distracting Blow like 999 out of 1,000 times. So, yeah. Flurry. 5 energy, 5-second recharge, stance. For 5 seconds, your attack rate is increased by 33%, but you deal 25% less damage. So, this is not great in PvP, but I use it all the time in PvE. The downside of dealing less damage is not actually that high, because that only applies to your weapon, and that's probably not dealing as much damage as you want anyway. And I don't believe it has an impact on the plus damage from weapons, although I'd have to double check that to be sure. You want to be attack faster. The big issue with this is it's very energy intensive. I am going to give this a 5, not because I think it deserves a 5, but because this is the increased attack speed skill that I basically always go to. This is my go-to for it. The decreased damage is basically made up for by the increased attack rate. So it's kind of a wash, but it increases your adrenaline gain rate at the cost of energy. That's basically what you're doing. You're trading energy for increased adrenaline gain rate, and faster damage packets, more damage packets, but slightly smaller damage packets. So, again, I personally use this one a lot, but a lot of people would probably rate it a bit lower than I do. So it's my go-to. Frenzied Defense is a very questionable skill. It's 5 energy, 10-second recharge, stance for 8 seconds, which is a very long time, especially with no attribute requirement. You have 75% chance to block incoming attacks, but you take double damage. This is actually a play on Frenzy. Frenzy came first. You'll notice that this also causes you to take double damage the last 8 seconds. This is a defensive one. I'm going to give this a 3. As far as defensive options go, this isn't bad if you're being attacked by a lot of physical attackers, because you're probably taking less damage with this. The 25% of attacks that get through and deal double damage, so it's kind of like blocking half of attacks, kinda. I don't actually know if that math checks out, but like, it definitely blocks for quite a bit. The issue with this, of course, is you take double damage from spells which don't care about your block chance. That's bad. You don't want to be taking double damage from spells. So, if you are in the situation where you kind of want that effect, it's fine, but it's just not great. Frenzy is the popular PvP increased attack speed skill. It's 5 energy, 4-second recharge, stance. For 8 seconds, you attack 33% faster, but take double damage. I'm going to be blunt. You can use this in PvE, but I generally would not. You do need a cancel stance with this, because if you start taking damage, you're going to want to like sprint or rush or something. Probably sprint, but you're going to want some other stance that you can use to stop this one from existing so you stop taking double damage. Both Frenzy Defense and Frenzy can benefit from that, as well as Primal Rage, a cancel stance, because they all have that double damage downside that allows you to be able to end that effect and, stop taking double damage. This is the single most common case for cancel stancing intentionally. So I don't use Frenzy. I'm going to give it a 3, though, because it is totally usable. It's definitely powerful. You just have to play with it very well, very carefully. It is more raw damage than something like Flurry will deal. The downside is different than a lot of the other ones. It's powerful, but I don't think it's as powerful as in PvE as it is in PvP. So be careful of the PvP bias if you are coming from that, I guess. I don't know. Grapple. 5 energy, 3/4 second activation time, 12-second recharge. Skill. You and target touched foe are knocked down. You lose your current stance. I'm assuming this makes... I'm not sure if this combos properly with steady stance or not. I might test that, actually. Let's go ahead and put on steady stance and grapple. And we will test that after talking about the rest of these skills. I don't usually use this because the downside is very large. I am going to give this a 2 just because there are potentially situations where you could kind of make this work, and I feel like this is a build around. Knocking down a foe is not terrible. And if this combos with steady stance in particular, that's really quite useful. So let's go ahead and talk about Skullcrack. I will test out grapple. Don't worry, I'll test that out with steady stance soon. Skullcrack is we'll talk about it. 9 adrenaline, no recharge, half-second activation time, elite melee attack, so this works with any melee weapon. If it hits, it interrupts the foe's current action. If that foe is casting a spell, that foe is dazed for 10 seconds. The dazed is fairly powerful. This is a bit finicky to use. It's very expensive. I'm going to give this a 3, though. It is an elite, which is not great. But the interrupting a spellcaster for dazed is very strong. And so that's worth giving it a 3 for, I think. I'm generally not running this, but it's not a bad skill. It's just outclassed, if that makes sense. So... And there's easier ways of inflicting dazed on things, to be clear. Rangers and Paragons both have better ways of inflicting dazed than Skullcrack. So that's another big point against it. But hey, it doesn't have a requirement, so there's that. Symbolic Strike is 4 adrenaline melee attack, so you can use it with any weapon. If this attack hits, you deal plus 12 damage for each signet you have equipped for a maximum of 70 additional damage. This is a 2. It's a very big build around me. You can build around... I believe it requires 6 signets on your bar to hit that maximum damage cap. That's going to be 72 damage, so it caps at 70. That's a huge cost. Like, don't get me wrong, there are some very good signets. They're just spread out across, like, all of the professions. If you're trying to do this on Warrior, you're really, really, really going deep on signets. However... at 2 signets, it is plus 24 damage, and at 3 signets, it is plus 36. Plus 36 damage is totally reasonable, so you don't actually need to max this out. As long as you're running a little higher on signets than normal, this is probably totally usable, and relatively powerful at that. So if you're bringing like Resurrection Signet, Antidote Signet, and some other random thing, I don't know what. Maybe you're using a PvE only signet. Maybe you're using Healing Signet. Maybe you're using this 1 in Strength that makes your attacks deal a plus 5 damage. If you get 3 signets on, then totally usable. It's okay at 2 signets. I would not bring it with just 1 signet, though. But yeah, this is... I don't know. I don't know if this is a 2 or a 3, but I feel like it's a 2 because you do have to kind of build around it some. And I feel like you have to build it around it just enough. It's a high 2, though. Wild Blow. 5 energy, 8 second recharge, melee attack. Huge downside of lose all adrenaline. But if it hits, this attack will result in a critical hit, and any stance being used by your target ends. This attack cannot be blocked. This skill is designed to end blocking stances. That is its purpose. I'm going to give this a 4 because the effect is very powerful. It is absolutely something that you want to use at times. The fact that you lose all adrenaline is actually not as big of a downside as it sounds like. And the reason for that is because if they're blocking, you're probably not gaining adrenaline anyway. This is a reliable way of ending stances. Now, in general, I'm not always going to bring it because there are other ways that you can do this. But for this effect, this is extremely powerful. This is a go-to. I would generally favor this as a stance ender above any of the ones that require adrenaline to use. I would also like to point out that this works pretty well on any other melee attacker. Assassin in particular can use this pretty well because they generally don't care about adrenaline, and they benefit from the critical hit. It'll give them a refund because of critical strikes. But they have their own ways of dealing with stances otherwise, so mileage may vary. But in general, like, this is a really good way of dealing with that one particular case of you're in an area, lots of stances, don't want to deal with it. Let's go ahead and leave Maguma Stade for the Great Temple of Balthazar and test out Grapple and Steady Stance real quick, just to see if they work together or not. Before I do that, let's be smart and throw some points in strength so I can sprint. So I don't know if this will work or not. I would like to know... Oh, well, there's also these windborne speed, so sprint is completely redundant. Oh well. You'll notice I lose sprint when I use that. Okay, grapple. Yes, it does work. So this becomes substantially better with the fact that it works with steady stance. The fact that it synergizes with steady stance makes it usable, makes it a solid 2. Okay, so I think that sums most of the stuff up. I'm just going to go back to the guild hall and say farewell. Here we are at my lovely Imperial Isle. So until next time, everyone, take care. Goodbye. And thanks for sticking with me on this one. It was long.